Yesterday, the Johns Hopkins Center for Civilian Biodefense Studies hosted a conference on bioterrorism. Over the next 3.5 hours, you'll hear from several experts on defense, foreign policy, and healthcare on the potential bioterrorist threat to the U.S. population and the actions communities can take in the event of an attack.
Good morning to you. I am D.A. Henderson. I'm director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Civilian Biodefense Studies, and it is a pleasure to welcome all of you here. On behalf of the sponsors, the Hopkins Center, Department of Health and Human Services, Infectious Diseases Society of America, and the American Society for Microbiology, as well as 12 other co-sponsors, all of which are listed in your program. This is the first national symposium on civilian bioterrorism whose intended audience is primarily public health and medical professionals. With the developments in this field and with the response today, it would seem likely that an annual national meeting may well be warranted. But why this symposium? Its provenance was a growing conviction in this and a number of other countries that the risk of a bioterrorist event has significantly increased. But questions as to what are the real risks have largely remained unaddressed. And no less has there been little consensus as to what should be done with respect to prevention or response. It was during the attendance of several of us at several ostensible training sessions, those of us both from academic and government, that we concluded there was a desperate need for expert input from those whose training and experience has been in the realm of treating disease and coping with challenges in the public health. And from that group came the planning committee for this conference, and their names are listed in your program at the back. Until recently, bioterrorism as a serious subject of study has been primarily the province of national security experts, law enforcement professionals, and the military. But bioterrorism, especially in a civilian setting, differs fundamentally from other national security threats in that the result of an attack using bioweapons will be an epidemic. It will not be over in a matter of minutes or a few hours, as would be the case with a chemical or explosive event. The suffering and deaths will continue for weeks, even months. The first responders to an epidemic will not be the police or the firefighters or the FBI or the National Guard. It will be physicians and nurses. And the institutions that will have to manage the aftermath of the attack and to assume responsibility for limiting the carnage and preventing additional deaths will not be our armed forces, but hospitals, clinics, and public health departments. To date, such groups have had little involvement in the strategic planning process. Now, some of you may be skeptical as to the real risks involved. Why spend time worrying about or preparing for a bioterrorist attack? After all, we've never had a serious incident. Is there more to the publicized fears of bioterrorism than science fiction? I'm hopeful that many of these questions will be answered, at least in part, over the next 2 days. For myself, events and revelations over the past 3 to 4 years have been transforming. Quite specifically, where I once believed that the catastrophic devastation of smallpox to have been consigned to history, I regret to say that in my assessment, this looms before us once again as a major threat, now joined by such as anthrax and plague. In my view, to remain unprepared is to invite disaster. The primary purpose of these 2 days is to engage you and the medical and public health communities in particular in a serious, in-depth review and discussion of the realities of a bioterrorist attack, not a devastating one, but a modest one. Based on a better understanding of the complex problems posed and the array of challenges and alternative directions, we would hope that a framework for planning and problem solving might emerge. It is critical that decisions about this country's response to the threat be grounded in fact, that plans be based on a realistic appraisal of the possible and the feasible and the needed. They must be based in good science and grounded in good and sound public health. Hard judgments about priorities and trade-offs among competing goals and issues must be weighed in light of other compelling agendas and health needs. In brief, those of us in the health professions and medical sciences must take the lead role in shaping future plans and programs. I would note parenthetically that plans for this meeting did not begin to evolve until really late last autumn. With comparatively short notice and a topic alien to the understanding of most, there was doubt expressed by most people that more than perhaps 200, perhaps 300 persons might attend. We made plans eventually to accommodate 950, but we've had to, 2 weeks ago, close registration, and we are doing our best to accommodate those who did arrive today. Please bear with us. You should know, however, that the proceedings of this will be published in Emerging Infections, and that the proceedings here will be netcast from the Johns Hopkins Infectious Disease website beginning about 1 March for those who could not attend. This morning, a number who have long been students of the threats of terrorism will describe for you the many changes which have taken place over recent years and the perception of the risk of a bioterrorist attack. They will focus primarily on revelations of activities in Russia and Iraq and the emergence of the threat of religious extremists such as the Japanese religious cult, the Aum Shinrikyo. The afternoon panel will discuss which of the almost infinite possible list of agents are the ones of greatest concern, agents that could seriously tax the medical and civil structure of a major city. Two in particular commend special attention: smallpox and anthrax, which for reasons you will hear are in a class by themselves. Congress has played an interested and vital role in providing needed funds to deal with counterterrorism, and wrapping up this afternoon session is Mr. Anthony McCann, Staff Director of the Subcommittee on Labor, Health, and Human Services of the House Appropriations Committee. He will provide a veteran's view from Congress. And tonight at dinner, we are privileged to have as our speaker Richard Clark of the National Security Council, the National Coordinator for Counterterrorism Programs. And tomorrow at lunch, we will explore the scientific and regulatory issues pertaining to the development of the principal vaccines. Now, finally, a word about tomorrow's program. What has been all too apparent to those of us working in this field is that amongst those now working in the field of counterterrorism, there is an almost but total lack of understanding of the implications of serious epidemic disease in the civilian sector. And in some ways, this is not surprising. Over the past 50 years, there have been few major disease epidemics that have seriously taxed our national and local health infrastructures. In fact, I would suggest we would have to go back to 1918, the swine flu, to identify an event which had an impact on the population which might approach that of a modest-sized bioterrorist event. Thus, it was the view of the Planning Committee that we should tomorrow take a somewhat unconventional approach for the conference and undertake with panel discussions a step-by-step exploration of the development of a hypothetical epidemic. And this plan includes a roundtable discussion involving key players from different sectors, from the governor's office, from federal government, from local government, to everyone who is involved. We need to, during this time, look to see what should be done and how and when and why, and to offer an appraisal as to where we stand today in preparation and what we now need to do. We hope you'll find it as illuminating as it has been to those of us who've been involved in developing it. We're very fortunate this morning to leading off this symposium, Dr. Donna Shalala, Secretary of the Health and Human Services, which with new funding now provided by the President and the Congress, is now assuming a very major lead in grappling with this very difficult problem. It is my honor to introduce to you Dr. Secretary Shalala.
Thank you very much, DA. Thank you for your leadership on this and on so many other issues. I was sort of amused when you called me doctor, particularly in this kind of group. As many of you know, I have a PhD, not an MD, and not in a science field. I was on an airplane, I guess about 5 years ago, and the stewardess came by and she said, "Dr. Shalala," and I said, "Yes." And she said, "Will you come to the back of the plane?" There was a woman in the back of the plane who was obviously having a baby. And there was a man standing there, and I said, "Mine's in political science. I hope yours is in medicine." And he said it was. Let me again thank D.A. Henderson and all of the co-sponsored for this very important conference. Years from now, people will point to this effort as an important turning point, I think, in expanding the number of leaders around the country on this issue and in improving the kind of coordination and shared experience and knowledge that we need. Let me also acknowledge that my good friend Josh Lederberg will be here later, another leader on this issue and an important, along with DA, coach for me on expanding my own both interest and the role of the department. I also want to acknowledge the many public health leaders from within the department who will be and are working already on this issue. In particular, here is Peggy Hamburg, the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation, who has the lead coordinating role in the department. Dr. Hamburg, as many of you know, was the New York City Health Commissioner, and in many ways is ideally placed to coordinate Harold Varmus, Jeff Copeland, Earl Fox, Jane Haney, and David Satcher, if anyone could coordinate all those people. Peggy can on this particular issue, and this is her highest priority for the department. In addition to that, I think it will be of interest to all of you that for the first time, I think in our history, with the enthusiastic support of Sandy Berger, the head of the National Security Council, there is a senior commissioned public health officer in the National Security Council who works there. Dr. Ken Bernard is not with us because he's recovering, I think, from an operation, but Ken is at the NSC, and his role working with Richard Clark is in fact to coordinate the public health role both nationally and internationally. So for the first time, we have a strong health presence in the National Security Council. Sandy Berger, when they announced the bioterrorism strategy, joked that when I came into the administration, I didn't know I was going to be a member of the NSC. The truth is that I was hoping that we would be able to convince the NSC of the role of both medicine and health in the security of the United States. And I want to say that the foreign policy leadership of this country has enthusiastically embraced both the department's role and, in particular, having senior members of the department more than present, but an integrated part of the teams. You'll hear from Richard Clark, and I can't say enough good things about Richard and his own leadership. I also noted that Tony McCann will be here. I want you to give him a warm welcome, not only because of his leadership on bioterrorism, but remember he's the senior staff person for all of the appropriations for health in the United States. And you ought to greet him with great warmth, because this is going to be a very important year in appropriations. Let me welcome all of you to the first ever National Symposium on Medical and Public Health Response to Bioterrorism. Over the past few months, many of you, like much of the country, have probably read Richard Preston's riveting bestseller about bioterrorism, The Cobra Event. It's really a haunting thriller in which he actually dedicates the book to public health professionals. But what he does is weave a very chilling and compelling tale about a lone terrorist attack on Manhattan with a genetically engineered virus. It's true that this story of designer-made disease on the rampage is a work of fiction, but it's also true that perhaps more than any other recent article or report, His thought-provoking novel has helped shine the national spotlight on the shadowy threat of bioterrorism. The book raises a very logical question. How do we successfully contain and combat this emerging threat? To do so, I believe that we must meet four important challenges. Four challenges that we really cannot ignore as a nation, and four challenges that government cannot meet alone. Our first challenge is to be aware that an act of bioterrorism could happen. The likelihood of an attack is entirely unknown, as Richard Clarke will report to you. It may never occur, but we've seen terrorism emerge as one of the thorniest problems of the post-Cold War era. We've seen that terrorists are always searching for new weapons, and we've already seen sarin nerve gas released in the Tokyo subway. It may not happen immediately, but somewhere, sometime in the future, terrorists may well threaten to use or attempt to use a biological weapon against the United States. But when discussing the possibility of a terrorist attack in the next few years, the President unequivocally stated that this is not a cause for panic. It is a cause for serious, deliberate, disciplined, long-term concern. In other words, we must not be afraid, but we must be aware. And that's why this national symposium is so important from our point of view, because it will help replace complacency with what we hope is a new sense of urgency, and because it will help keep the national spotlight focused on the threat of bioterrorism. Of course, once we're fully aware that a bioterrorism event could happen, then our second challenge is to do everything we can to be prepared. With the threat of bioterrorism knocking at our door, we can't afford to be caught off guard, because it's only in the movies like Outbreak that we can save the world from a deadly virus in just 24 hours. And that's why my department is spending $158 million this fiscal year to begin to prepare our infrastructure for bioterrorism. And that's why we have an internal coordinating mechanism, both with the NSC and the other government agencies, as well as within the department. And that's why the President has proposed increasing that investment by an additional $72 million in fiscal year 2000. This investment will fund our ongoing anti-bioterrorism initiative. This initiative is designed to significantly raise our level of preparedness this year. And this year alone, the initiative is expanding its activities in a number of key areas. These include surveillance, medical response, building a stockpile of pharmaceuticals, and research and development. We're working to improve and strengthen this country's public health surveillance network, including detection and reporting and electronic communications and laboratories. Every year I've gone to the Congress and talked about the public health infrastructure and our need for investment in that infrastructure for a variety of different reasons. This year and last year, when we started to talk about bioterrorism, people started to get it, that the key to it, as DA pointed out, is the public health infrastructure and the relationship between that and the medical and health communities. We're also enhancing our epidemiological capacity so we can quickly respond to a suspected biological agent. And we're enhancing our medical response capacity by spearheading an administration-wide effort to develop infrastructure at the local and at the national levels. By establishing medical response teams in major American cities specifically designed to deal with the consequences of bioterrorism, and by expanding our capacity to provide immunizations, infection control, and patient care on a massive scale. We're creating and maintaining an unprecedented national stockpile of drugs and vaccines for civilian use in case of a bioterrorist attack. And finally, we're accelerating our research and development in diagnostics and vaccines so we can more effectively combat any threat. In addition, we'll be working to decipher and to map the genetic material of microbes so that we can quickly identify biological agents and develop new therapies. all of our efforts in surveillance, all of our efforts in medical response, in stockpile development, and research and development, we believe will help to prepare us to meet and beat any bioterrorist threat. And you can hear in our planning and in the discussions that all of you will have, and of course in what DA said himself, that we're talking about public health and medicine. We're talking about the healthcare sector, not just public health professionals, but the entire healthcare sector being integrated in a way in which it responds together in a coordinated way. Of course, if we really want to be prepared, then our third challenge is, of course, for this public health and medical community to take the lead in the fight against bioterrorism. With a conventional terrorist attack, it's the military and law enforcement that are the first line of defense. But with bioterrorism, it's the public health and medical communities who stand directly on the front lines. And how well we respond to that threat will depend on how well our public health and medical communities function and how well they function together. Think about it. If a specific bioterrorism threat is issued, perhaps someone claims to have released a deadly disease in a public place, then trained public health officials must first verify that an incident has actually occurred and then identify the biological agent. They may need to decontaminate the area. They may need to determine the likelihood of secondary transmission. They will need to identify exposed populations. They will need to provide preventive measures and treatments. This is not a situation, as I have pointed out to our very fine U.S. military, in which if something is released, you call in the Marines. The answer is that you call in health professionals. Of course, if a threat isn't issued and no warning is given, the attack would be silent. Affected individuals may not develop symptoms for days or even for weeks, and the victims would be visiting many doctors throughout the large area. Quarantine would not be a viable option because only one biological agent, smallpox, is communicable. And even with smallpox, it would be impossible to know to whom to quarantine due to the long time period between infection and the development of symptoms. A strong communications network is what we'll need to piece together early reports and quickly determine what happened so that public health officials could promptly identify the deadly agent, the route of exposure, and the likely origin. The CDC, of course, would be an important part of this process because of its particular expertise in infectious disease. And everyone, from physicians who first see the victims to the scientists who identify the infectious agents, must coordinate their efforts. And that means community health centers as well as hospitals as well as individual physicians. And that brings me to our fourth and final challenge. We have to all work together. In the fight against bioterrorism, the federal government, particularly my department, has an obvious leadership role to play. Among other things, we need to support state and local planning efforts, to provide training at every level, to develop an infrastructure for developing and delivering mass medical care, and to offer expertise to communities across the country. But this is a fight we certainly can't win by ourselves. Across the board, we have to forge new working partnerships among health and public safety and intelligence agencies. We need an unprecedented cooperation between the federal government, between the state and local health agencies and the medical communities. And we have to ensure that plans for managing the medical consequences of terrorist acts are well integrated and coordinated with the other national emergency response systems. But there's another aspect to working together. We know that the microbes spread across boundaries of culture and language and territory. We know that an act of bioterrorism cannot be contained by any national border or barrier. And we know that when it comes to microbes, we aren't protected in the world of, in any world. The Indian poet Tagore talks about narrow domestic walls that protect no one. Such microbes recognize no border. In our battle against them, neither can we. The fight against bioterrorism has to be a global fight, and that's why I'm pleased to see representatives from so many different countries here today. Because we share a common future, we have to share a common ground. Or as Dr. Gru Brundtland, the Director General of the World Health Organization, has said, when it comes to public health and safety, solutions like problems have to be global in scope. So as we work together to defend ourselves against bioterrorism, to defeat bioterrorism, we also have to do one more thing. We must do what we're doing at this symposium. We have to pool our wits and our will, as well as our resources. It is precisely our restless intellects, it is precisely our soaring imaginations that are the most potent weapons and the greatest resources in the collective fight against bioterrorism. We have come a very long way in just our initial thinking about how we need to organize ourselves. But we need to pit our wits and our will to do the battle and to ensure that we meet our challenges so that we are aware, so that we are prepared, so that we take the lead, so that we always work together, and so that we see this as a continuous process, not simply to put a system in place, but to put a system that is continuously being improved, and a system of communications that will take the best thinking of this generation and put it in place to protect our safety and our health. Thank you very much. Have a great symposium.
We will pause for just a moment until the next panel comes up. We're grateful indeed for the leadership provided by the Secretary and by the Department at this point in time. And I think my own feeling is that this is a marvelous opportunity, if one looks at it, with the strengthening of what we need with bioterrorism. We have an opportunity to strengthen our basic public health infrastructure, our relationships between health and medicine, and indeed to be able to better address the number of problems that deal with new and emerging infections, that deal with antibiotic resistance, and at the same time being prepared for the bioterrorism. So I think in many ways this is a conference which extends well beyond even bioterrorism, because I think it's the implications for the future of public health. If I may now, may I invite Dr. Siegrist and Inglesby and to come up, and we'll move on to the next section of the program.
Pleasure.
Good morning, and again, welcome. I am Tom Inglesby from the Center for Civilian Biodefense Studies at Johns Hopkins, and I have the privilege of introducing the chair of this morning's expert panel. But first, a few housekeeping announcements. There'll be a chance for members of the audience to ask questions of the panel following the final panel presentation at 11:35. We would ask you to hold your questions until that time. The lunch break today will be from 12 to 1:30, and the hotel has set up a number of fast-moving buffet lunches so you can be well-fed and right back in your seat at 1:30 for the start of the afternoon session. There's more information about those lunch buffets in your registration packet, and there are many other lunch options in the area. Without further delay, let me introduce you to Mr. David Siegrist, chair of this morning's panel entitled Reality of the Threat, Why is There Concern Now? David Siegrist was a National Strategic Policy Fellow at Georgetown University, where he received his master's degree in government. He has worked as an analyst for the Department of Defense on a broad range of national security issues, including transnational threats. and is editor of a forthcoming book, Countering Biological Terrorism. He is now a research fellow and study director for Countering Biological Terrorism at the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies and an adjunct faculty member of Georgetown University, where he teaches courses in national security and intelligence. Mr. David Segrist.
Thank you very much, Tom. Madam Secretary, distinguished participants, it's a great pleasure and honor to be with you today at this very important conference. The possibility of biological attacks on American cities is truly a disturbing one. If such an attack were to occur, it is people like those in this room who will be called upon to overcome it. You are all to be congratulated for your interest in this topic. You may be called upon to play a critical role in this area. The topic of this panel concerns the reality of the threat. Why is there concern now? I will be giving a brief overview before the panelists discuss specific examples. I have asked all the speakers to remain on schedule so that we may address as many questions as possible from the audience at the conclusion of our session. I shall try to set a good example for timeliness, although that will be difficult. For a biological attack to take place, three elements must be in place. First, there must be a vulnerable target for such an attack. Secondly, some individual or group must have the capability to conduct the attack. Finally, that potential perpetrator must have the intent, the willingness to carry out such an attack. I shall discuss each of these aspects in turn very briefly. I'll begin with vulnerability to attack. Among weapons of mass destruction, biological weapons have an order of magnitude more destructive power than chemical weapons, including nerve gas. In certain circumstances, biological weapons can be as devastating as nuclear ones, with a few kilograms of anthrax able to kill as many people as a Hiroshima-sized nuclear weapons. For those of you in the back on this chart, this is from the National Defense University strategic assessment, and the takeaway point from the chart is that they have an illustration of a weapons laydown between a 10-kiloton nuclear weapon and 10 kilograms of anthrax. The takeaway point is that there's more red area in the one with anthrax. Continuing with the vulnerability point. As to readiness, the U.S. is currently unprepared to deal with a biological attack. Over the past several years, the U.S. has made important strides to respond to WMD incidents, especially in its largest cities. However, much of the needed equipment is not in hand. Pathogen sensors are not in place to detect that a biological attack has even taken place. New medicines are needed. To combat terrorist attacks, treatment is a more practical approach than prevention. Yet many biological agents are extremely difficult to treat once the victim presents symptoms. In addition, many of the most important current prophylactic treatments, which you give before the symptoms present but after challenge, these treatments have limited shelf lives that do not easily lend them to stockpiling. Their effectiveness could also possibly be overcome by a sophisticated attacker. U.S. emergency medical crisis response capability is limited. A number of localities define a mass casualty event as one with greater than 12 victims, far fewer than might present after an intentional biological release. Much emergency medical capability is also located in downtown areas that themselves may be the subject of attack. Major American cities' emergency room capacity can already be overwhelmed all too quickly by more common emergencies. To cope with large-scale biological attack, the National Disaster Medical System has voluntary access to approximately 100,000 hospital beds across the country. However, not all of those beds may have the specialized means for patient respiration and supportive therapy that may be needed in a crisis. Such equipment may not be available in large numbers, even from deployable Department of Defense war stocks. In addition, since victims may be contagious, remote localities may hesitate to welcome them for care, especially if they fear smallpox or a genetic weapon was used, some other kind of transmissible virus. The current American administration is making important strides to increase U.S. preparedness for biological attack. Technical research is being supported, needed medicines and vaccines will be acquired, and emergency response templates are being developed. Important efforts such as these are going to be discussed at this conference. I think you all join me in congratulating the Secretary and the administration for their far-sighted view toward addressing American health vulnerability to biological events. It is people like the ones in this room who need to become actively engaged if we are to be prepared to overcome biological terrorism. That's one reason that this conference is so important. Returning to my 3 points, I now turn to whether potential perpetrators have the capability to attack the U.S. For biological weapons, one needs sample cultures, the means to grow, purify, and stabilize them, and the means to reliably disseminate them. There are many sources of sample cultures of pathogens, including over 1,000 biological culture libraries worldwide, as well as numerous research institutions and natural sources for these sample cultures. Growth media and fermenters to multiply the sample cultures are widely available. The biological production facilities themselves may be small, inexpensive, and inconspicuous. Equipment to develop biological arms is also dual use. That is, it has legitimate commercial and research purposes as well as nefarious ones. For biological weapons, there are no equivalents to special nuclear materials that can be subject to arms control. Indeed, in Iraq, we have seen the most intrusive arms control inspection regime in history, and yet UNSCOM and the U.S. government believe that Iraq still retains significant quantities of chemical and biological arms. Note on the chart that there are literally tons of growth media unaccounted for, as well as specialized equipment for processing biological cultures into weapons. However, making reliable biological weapons requires some art as well as science. They are not readily susceptible to cookbook-type recipes that may be implemented by novices. And people who download anthrax.zip from the internet may be more dangerous to themselves than to others. Nevertheless, worldwide expertise and sophistication about biological processes has become much more widespread. Significant technical expertise is definitely required to produce high-quality, military-grade biological weapons and the reliable means for their dissemination. However, terrorist applications may be somewhat less demanding technically. Biological weapons can range in sophistication from salmonella used to temporarily incapacitate all the way up to the super bubonic plague engineered by the former Soviet Union. Biological weapons include the ricin that an extremist may wish to use to assassinate a local official, to pathogens with high transmissibility and broad potential impact. Biological agents may be used to kill or disable people, or they may be used to attack plants and/or animals to harm a nation's economy. Given that broad scope, it is clear that biological attacks have already taken place and continue to be a distinct probability for the foreseeable future. However, what mostly concerns us here today is a sizable lethal attack against a population center. Depending on their sophistication, terrorist groups may or may not be able to build broad impact biological weapons. However, some rogue states and the former Soviet Union are well known to have biological weapons capability. A potential state sponsor of biological terrorism may be Iraq's Saddam Hussein. He has sacrificed billions of dollars for his country by defying UN sanctions in order to maintain Iraq's potential for nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. Before the Gulf War, Iraq had produced thousands of liters of concentrated anthrax, for one, and tested a remote-controlled aircraft that could disseminate the germs. At Al-Hakam, Iraq, under the eyes of the inspectors, Saddam was able to make high-quality, dried biological pesticides that were processed remarkably similarly to weaponized anthrax. In the recent bombing campaign, Saddam's biological production capabilities were specifically not targeted by the Americans and the British aircraft because of a lack of targeting data and the fear of collateral damage if they actually hit them. Lately, there have been press reports that in the New York Times that veteran terrorist Abu Nidal has been welcomed into Baghdad. Nidal's representatives have also been reported to be meeting in Sudan with those of Osama bin Laden. Bin Laden himself is claimed to have gone missing from Afghanistan. The possibility exists of an alliance among a number of elements whose main tie is to wish ill to the United States, the United Kingdom, and our allies in the Middle East. A number of disturbing threats may have come together. One is a rogue state with a potent germ arsenal and a ruthless leader who bears a terrible grudge. A new wrinkle is Abu Nidal, a cold-blooded terrorist whose network may effectively implement the will of those who pay and protect them. These two actors may now be joined by the religious fundamentalist Osama bin Laden, who has several times declared war on America. Bin Laden's accused followers have previously struck inside continental United States at the World Trade Center with the intent to inflict many thousands of casualties. Certainly in this case, I believe that the existence of the raw capability to wage a significant biological and/or other attack on the United States and its interests is plausible. That brings us to the third major question: intention. Why would anyone wish to commit such a horrendous act? There are three ongoing trends that I find disturbing. One is a trend in terrorism itself. In the past, terrorism was about making a political statement through violence. It was designed to influence an audience. In Brian Jenkins' memorable phrase, terrorists wanted a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead. Levels of violence were carefully calculated so as to draw attention, but not so high as to alienate supporters or trigger overwhelming response from the authorities. That continues to be a main theme of conventional terrorism. There is a troubling contrary tendency, however, that is towards so-called postmodern or super terrorism, in which the aim is to maximize the number of casualties inflicted. This reflects a shift in the goal of the terrorists from trying to make a statement through violence to one in which damage to the target is an end in itself. Such a terrorist may be motivated by ethnic or pseudo-religious considerations. For instance, Japanese terrorists from Shinrikyo cult told prosecutors they were conferring a blessing on their victims when they attacked them. Somewhat similarly, Osama bin Laden has stated that he believes it is his religious duty to try to obtain chemical and biological weapons, and that his war extends to all Americans, at least all those of us who pay our taxes. So a certain subset of terrorists may be motivated to commit mass casualty terrorism, including biological terrorism. A second entity with a motive to perpetrate a biological attack could be a rogue state. As the world's remaining superpower, the United States is virtually invulnerable to a conventional military challenge. Other nations would hardly try to match us plane for plane or tank for tank. However, our very strength provides an incentive to would-be adversaries to make their challenge to us unconventionally. The Pentagon refers to this as the asymmetric threat. If a regime were motivated to mount an asymmetric attack on the U.S., it might choose biological weapons to do so. Biological weapons have a high lethality density. Their extreme destructive potential is concentrated in a relatively small and unremarkable package with virtually no detectable sensor signature. Because of the germ's incubation period, the perpetrators might be long gone before anyone even knew that an attack had taken place. Finally, biological agents lend themselves to clandestine dissemination. They do not require a ballistic missile with its telltale parabola revealing its point of origin, for retaliation presumably, but only a more common dispenser, such as a humble and untraceable agricultural sprayer, or even a fire extinguisher, in some cases a spray can. Would any nation take the risk to wage covert war on the United States? The Defense Science Board has revealed that Libya pursued a systematic campaign against U.S. interests following President Reagan's retaliation on it for the LaBelle disco bombing in Berlin. This sustained covert campaign over years included many terrorist acts that culminated in the downing of Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. It also included Libyan contacts with the El Rukns street gang in Chicago and the attempt to supply them with Stinger-type missiles to shoot down airliners taking off from O'Hare Airport. This attack was prevented. However, I find it a disturbing example of a rogue state reaching out clandestinely to a domestic group to try to perpetrate mass casualty terrorism in the United States. So I believe that there are disturbing trends within the contemporary terrorism and international relations communities that may support concern about a biological attack on the continental United States or our interests abroad. However, there are certain kinds of biological assault that one may have high confidence in predicting. Dr. Stephen Morse of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency has said that Mother Nature is the great terrorist. Since infectious diseases were widely dismissed as a world health threat some 30 years ago, nature has loosed some 30 new or re-emerging infectious diseases on the world. I've listed some of them here. I apologize if you all can't see them. You're all quite familiar with what they are: AIDS, Ebola, hantaviruses, a number of deadly killers. And indeed, a terrible influenza pandemic was averted several years ago by the alert and energetic actions of epidemiologists in Hong Kong and around the world, including some people in this room. However, more could be in store. As seen on this chart, contributing causes for outbreaks of emerging infectious diseases include overcrowding, deforestation, airline travel, and other factors that seem likely to continue for the foreseeable future. This makes it highly likely and highly desirable that the U.S. must further prepare to meet medical emergencies in this country. My contention is that if we prepare to confront and defeat intentional human releases of pathogens, we will be better prepared to confront and defeat the seemingly random but robust naturally occurring threats that are highly likely to occur. For emergency medical response, patients still need rapid and efficacious treatment, whether the source of an outbreak of disease is man-made or naturally occurring. So I think enhanced emergency medical response is important. But also for medical research, there is a common requirement for drugs that treat disease after symptoms become apparent. Such drugs might target common features of disease, the shared underlying ways that many diseases actually wreak their damage on victims. Such common factors include the inflammation cascade and toxic shock, for instance. Aerosol challenge is also typical of both military or airborne pathogens. Vaccines that enhance mucosal immunity may mitigate them. These are all ideas for consideration. There may also be specific genes that are critical and unique to a number of pathogens. Medicines might one day inhibit their expression. Effective and safe, multi-purpose, and as well as specific drugs would help us to gain the initiative in the battle against both naturally occurring and intentional releases of infectious disease. Through advanced biotechnology, we could begin to reverse the offense-defense mismatch that currently greatly favors disease over cures. Although such drugs represent a massive technical challenge, people such as those in this hall have risen to and met daunting health challenges in the past with less reason to believe in their ultimate success. Finally, in considering the three categories of vulnerability, capability, and intention, I believe the most important need for action is to further limit American vulnerability to biological terrorism by enhancing our emergency medical preparedness and by supporting advanced pharmaceutical research. This will help to both deter and defeat deliberate pathogen releases, as well as to overcome naturally occurring disease outbreaks that we expect in the future. Thank you very much. We'll now turn to our panelists. I'd like to, where's Christopher? Christopher, could you come on up? I'd like to introduce Dr. Christopher Davis. Dr. Davis is an MD and a PhD in biomedical research, a physician with over 20 years' experience, who was educated at the universities of Oxford and London. As part of the Defense Intelligence Staff for 10 years in Great Britain, Dr. Davis was responsible for the collation, analysis, and assessment of intelligence on biological weapons and the medical aspects of chemical and biological weapons. As such, he took a leading role as technical advisor to international and U.S. and British diplomatic efforts on arms control and disarmament. He was played a leading role in debriefing the initial Soviet defectors from their biopreparat genetic engineering weapons program, and was also a key inspector in an exchange of experts with the former Soviet Union. For his contribution to international security, Dr. Davis was honored by Her Majesty the Queen in 1992 and became a holder of the Order of the British Empire. Dr. Davis.
Thank you, David. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That lovely introduction. I am truly honored to be here today. It's a great privilege. As the sole Englishman, I think, who will be standing on the stage, it's really quite important to me. More important, perhaps, is the fact that the conference is taking place at all. Because for most of my professional life, it's been extremely hard to persuade anybody that there's a problem. And this conference marks then a sort of watershed whereby we have moved out of considering it in the secret, the diplomatic and the world of government and the world of international diplomacy, to give the problem back to healthcare professionals. So, Professor Henderson, thank you very much for inviting me. I'd like to say a few words of thanks to David Segrist and Monica Schoch-Spanner for all the work they've done behind the scenes. I think I got invited to come to Washington to speak to a few people about these few problems in Russia and Iraq. I didn't realize it was a cast of thousands that I'd be facing. That's probably Mike Osterholm's fault as well, so he's out there somewhere. Thank you very much, Mike. I think if I hit this button here, let's try again. There's a slide missing there, I'm sorry. This is what I was going to start the conference with. Why? Because in the face of all this doom, gloom, disaster, and death, you really have to have something to cheer yourself up. If you've seen this before, as I'm sure you have, my thanks go to Gary Larson, of course, it comes from. And it says, if you can't read it at the back because it's slightly degenerated, so please welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Melvin Fenwick, the man who back in 1952 first coined the now common phrase, "Fools, I'll destroy them all." Now, this is not aimed at you at all, but it does say something because we should consider the psychology of the people we're dealing with. And very often, a problem we've had over the years in the Western nations is not to cast our mind to what our adversaries might be doing and what might be thinking, their cultural background, what motivates them. what looks like evil and disaster as far as we're concerned, as has been said, can sometimes be driven by what are seen to be perfectly reasonable rationales, either at a state level or at a terrorist level. It's important to get beyond thinking about projecting your own reality onto someone else's before you can start to face the problem. I'm sorry, I'll have to apologize. I've been attacked by a biological agent myself, and I'm suffering a heavy cold. Now, I am using, they said it would work. I never trust electrons. Ever since Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, I mean, what can you say? I went for slides on the basis that computers, what can you say? This is me, and you've heard all about me. That's very boring. This is the title of my slide, of the entire piece that I'm giving today. And you may think, well, what's he going on about? He is mad. That's why he's here. No, indeed. We are now getting beyond this point, but I say it because for so many years in the government community of scientists, we labored against this particular background. The tunnel vision brought on by successive governments, the mistaken belief that it's only the size of your bang that matters, i.e. that when nuclear weapons became so overpowering within the world, every other possibility and threat against us was relegated, and to get anybody to think and talk about them was very difficult. Ironically, I was told this week by friends of mine still in the nuclear round that within this town you can't get anybody to talk about nuclear now because the only way you can get any money is to do biological. So, you know, I should be complaining. Right, I'm reprising a few things here because you come from a wide number of backgrounds, different levels of expertise and involvement. And David's been through this already, but it's important just to start with a definition, I feel, at the beginning of 2 days of complex talks. There's always a debate about what's a weapon, what's an agent. When is an agent a weapon? And I'll say a little bit more about that. This I won't bother to go through. It's a pretty straightforward rubric. But as I say, the important thing at the bottom is that weapons in this context embraces a wide variety of possibilities, so that you can go all the way from that hand-delivered idea that Richard Preston had, and it's been around for many, many years, all right, all the way up to a sophisticated missile warhead or cruise missile delivery system. Now, why biological weapons? Well, actually, David's already gone through some of this already himself. You have multiple delivery systems. We've mentioned that. Wide utility. You can go all the way from an individual death or disablement all the way up to mega death or whatever you want. Good logistics. You can have dual-use production. You can have very small quantities of material in the end that you need. They're very versatile. You can cause deaths or casualties. They can be persistent or non-persistent, transmissible, non-transmissible. And defense is difficult. And that's why we're here. Excuse me. One of the particular things, of course, there's no damage to materiel and physical infrastructure, and that's key to the thinking that lies behind why you would acquire any sort of biological weapons capability. Also, the other key is that it's easy to conceal. When you do nuclear work, it's much more difficult to conceal. I also want to say that I argue slightly with the whole concept of weapons of mass destruction. It's become very popular. It was first coined back in the 1960s, and it's somewhat confusing. It lumps all together nuclear, biological, and chemical, as if in the public mind they've become equivalent, exchangeable. A nuclear, a chemical, we use some biological, and we use those words so often, and we hear them on the news. And it really isn't good for our understanding. There are a range of nuclear weapons that have their effects and purposes, chemical weapons likewise, and especially, par excellence, biological weapons, as we said. It's a question of purpose, intent, what you want to do. The same with ordinary ballistic sort of weapons. You would never think of talking about them all together in one group. A handgun is not a tank. They're designed for different purposes, and it's important that we break up these ideas so that we stop just talking about one single weapon, as if it covers everything. I would certainly highlight the problem here that we all have, and there are two of these key ones, and one is diagnosis. And I raise that now because it's very obvious, but in the case of being attacked by biological weapons, you're not, and you well know this out there, simply talking about another outbreak of disease, because the amount of infectious agent may be huge by comparison to that which causes an ordinary infection. The key to the difficulty may lie in the picture that you expect to have is not the picture that you see because of this. That's just one aspect of diagnosis. Attribution is another key point. How do you know who has done what, especially if they don't say it? First of all, you've got to decide you've been attacked. And then people say, oh, well, of course, we may counter this attack. Well, you have to start pointing the finger. And if no one stands up and says it's me, it can be very difficult. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of history, because the history places in context some other things I'm going to say. And some of you may or may not recognize this slide, but it's actually a Second World War picture. It's from the back of a Lancaster bomber. It's a British airman. And what he's doing is tipping cattle cake down a tube that will be dropped out of the bottom of the aircraft. Now, this didn't actually happen, but it was, in fact, the first retaliatory biological weapon produced, and it was the one ordered by Winston Churchill, the N weapon, and it was cattle cake loaded with anthrax. And this came out of the program, which was originally started in Grugnard Island, which of course ultimately was transferred. We did have, I know, 5 million cattle cakes. They were never used, obviously, because we never got to the point of having to retaliate in that way, but they were there ready to go. They're now all been destroyed, I hasten to say. After Grugnard Island, I've just listed here a few of the trials that took place. There was a huge Allied program because we were small and under attack, obviously. Many of you will appreciate the vast majority of the R&D transferred to the United States and Canada, and principally the United States, and they then launched a huge program. And so we have a whole series of trials going on with all these types of agents. Just to give you an idea that we're not talking in isolation here, we're not talking about fantasy, and we're not talking about science fiction. We're talking about scientists who have done a great deal of work. Now, the programs I'm going to talk about in Russia and Iraq also did not spring out of nowhere. The US biological weapons program was huge, extremely complex, comprehensive. I'll pick out one little statistic here, which I always find fascinating, and that's that the US Naval BW Trials Flotilla was, at the time, let's say 60s, the fifth largest navy in the world had it declared independence and gone on its own. That gives you an idea of exactly what was going on. We're not talking about something that didn't go well and didn't go badly. And the worst thing that happened, perhaps, about the unilateral disarmament carried out by President Nixon was persuade the world that that entire program had been a bit of a flop, a bit of a failure. You couldn't control biological weapons. You know, we got rid of it because it didn't really work. That's entirely false. And what it did was lay in the background these ideas spoken from the highest level that left us with a legacy for the next 20 years of arguing against that. I mean, if the US had said their program didn't work, well, how could you say anybody else has got a program that works? It simply wasn't true. The program was destroyed for many other reasons under an atmosphere of complex intelligence, politics, the usual sort of stuff that doesn't ever quite work out. Just to show that there were some pointy bits at the end of all this, this slide is of a Sergeant missile containing some bomblet warheads. The picture is highly degraded, as you can see. I'm sorry for the people at the back. I seem to have caused myself a small swimming pool here, by the way, so if I dodge about a bit, you'll have to forgive me. The warhead in that picture was filled with these little bomblets containing a couple of 100 mils of liquid agent. and they were designed to fall and bounce and split open and spread their agent, just to show that real weapons do exist. I'll now move on to my main part of the talk, which is, in fact, the first part is the Soviet program. And as the introduction told you, I've spent a lot of time studying it. I've been there. I went in the first group in the secret contacts we had with the Soviet Union at the time of the Gulf War. And this rather poor slide just gives you an idea of a number of the establishments all over the then Soviet Union. It was published in 1993, I think, in the open press. So it stretches right the way across, as you can see. I just wanted to give you an idea of the breadth of what was going on there. I'll now move on. Okay. So, what did we think about the Russian former Soviet system? Well, it was two systems. It became, I won't go into a lot of history. In fact, the whole biological weapons program of the former Soviet Union dates back to around 1919 with a number of pronouncements by Lenin. It really got underway in the 1920s, and trials began at the Shikany Chemical Weapons Proving Ground. That was determined as being too dangerous. I'll flip right the way forward to the post-war era, when there was a great jump forward in building within the Ministry of Defense a number of plants and storage facilities. And then the next big jump is in around the late 1960s, early 1970s, whereby the Russians decided that as a result of the convention coming in, they didn't believe for 1 minute that the Americans, the US, had abandoned their program, and they said, we're not taking any notice of this stupid piece of paper, because that's what it is. Let's get on and do what they've been doing. And they assumed you transferred all your capability into academia and industrial pharmaceutical plants. Let's do that, and let's take advantage of what they saw was coming, which would be the genetic engineering revolution. They also thought, such luminaries as Ovchinnikov, thought that they'd be able to take biological base and turn it into a production base for chemical type weapons, if you like, so that they could take it away from the chemical industry and provide whatever biologically active substances they wanted. So that then built into what we know as Biopreparat, a huge system alongside the military system. The military system was meant to transfer entirely into the civil system. It never did in the end, and so there are two systems. It was kicked off in 1973 with 1.5 million rubles of funding. Over the next 15 years, it probably soaked up 1.5 billion. It had about 25,000 scientists in it, the flower of a generation, really. Chemists, biologists, microbiologists, engineers. Really, it was the place to be if you're going to make a career. Whilst we were getting on making our pharmaceutical and biotech industries, that's what they were doing. About 15% of the work was in fact civil. The rest of it was entirely military. The whole thing was funded by the military and was controlled from the very top. The chief of Biopreparat always had direct access to the Politburo. This nonsense about them never knowing about it and had been out of control and it was a side program, it's completely untrue. It was the most secret program, and it was a political decision. So it had vast scope. I say its status was above nuclear, highest political backing, huge finance. It was ultimately under military control, and it achieved in the end large agent production capacity, and to the point where they had mobilization for war plans ready to go and weapons ready to go. Well, they've had weapons for years and years and years, but well before 1985 of the new type. I show this slide. It's 28 Corpus Naya Street in Leningrad, St. Petersburg, because it's part of what we came laughingly, or as a bit of a joke, to call the extremely, unbelievably, extraordinarily pure Biochemical Preparations Institute. It's the Institute of Ultra-Pure, if you need to know. And it's part of Biopreparat. And it has a main building, but it has a number of other buildings. It started in old building, and this is one of them. and you would never guess from walking along it outside what it was. The whole institute, they did a lot of basic R&D on weapons material without actually necessarily using agent. This is inside that building. You can find things like this. This was a full-size explosive test chamber, picture I took when we were allowed to go back for a second time, since we weren't allowed to take any photographs the first time. As you can see, the door to that chamber is pitted from explosive tests. In another building very similar, there is this. And this was built between the time that Vladimir Pasechnik, who was referred to earlier, came out to the United Kingdom in 1989, October 1989, and when we went in January 1991. And this is a dynamic test chamber. It's for looking at the auto-disaggregation of solid material in the air. They actually said it was for studying ecology or, I don't know, pollution on leaves and things like that. But I shan't go into the complexities of having to deal with people who lie to you all the time. That's the other thing. I mean, they don't play cricket, you know. It's... But they are very dedicated, extremely clever, and never make the mistake of thinking that because they look foolish, they are foolish. They aren't. And because the places look Heath Robertson are a bit dirty and don't look like the wonderful labs you have here, doesn't mean to say they're not effective and that haven't got brains the size of small planets, because they have. All right? That's just a comment about never underestimating your adversary. This was put in, then, between the time at which their first major defection occurred and the time we went. That was the confidence that was there. Okay, I've got a few key aims here for their program, because I want to convey to you that it's not just all about brewing up bugs, ultimately. They had industrial production scale-up techniques they were wanting to improve on. They wanted to improve on production rates, on the yield of viable microorganisms, on virulence in every case across the broad number that they were dealing with, resistance of microorganisms to antibiotics they were increasing. The last reported one was at least having achieved the capability to retain within an organism that would reproduce multiple resistance, at least more than 6, maybe more than 10, and was quoted as much as 16. Whether that's absolutely true or confirmed, I do not know. Obviously, we all know that technically it's extremely difficult. But just because it's difficult doesn't mean to say that other people haven't done it. And the classic point I would make here is that when we first came out, I can remember the Friday that I got the first message in October about Vladimir coming out. And the key to what was on the paper was plague, as far as I was concerned. I said, that's it. We're now talking about a definite strategic weapon designed to attack continental United States or Europe, okay? When I brought all this material to the United States, discussed it with all my colleagues, they took it to the people who had worked previously in the US program, very fine men, wonderful people who've helped enormously since that time. But their initial reaction was, well, we abandoned plague in 1961-62. We just couldn't get it to work. You can't do it. It won't work. And that's the answer that came back. Don't you think you've got it wrong? I said, that was 62. This is 89. You've just spent 15 billion rubles and there are 25,000 people been working for 20 years. Do you think they might have solved it? Yes, is the answer. All right? No disrespect to the elders behind those comments, but it's just, and the fact is that by certain manipulations, they did solve it, and we know exactly how they did it now. Maximize viability during dissemination. Well, that goes back to some of the things I've been saying, and as aerosols. Enhance the ability of microorganisms to degrade the defense of the target so that they were looking at various engineered possibilities for expression of molecules in the initial infection phase in an individual to downgrade the immune system so that the infection would carry on in a faster route and gain a better grip much more quickly and be more difficult for the individual to combat, even with a low dose. And what this slide illustrates for you is a comprehensive program. BioPreparat wasn't all just a series of microbiology institutes. It had everything from engineering at one end to dispersal and some test grounds at the other. It's about taking the entire elephant, always difficult to eat in one go, and eating it bite by bite by chopping it up into pieces. I'm sorry about the analogy. Someone said it was awful the other day, and I'm nothing against elephants, by the way. Honestly, I'm a big elephant fan, okay? Anyway, I must fly on. We talked about, I must say a few words about agents, because on this page you will see a list of agents. They don't contain all of the critical agents. There are one or two I would put in there and discuss at length with you, but the ones that are outlined in black, plague, anthrax, tularemia, etc., are key former Soviet Russian agents. So I really, I would, oh, I'm sorry, someone seems to have attacked my slides. Dave? I said, oh, we're out of time. Oh dear, right. Right, I didn't notice. Well, I've done nothing on Iraq. I'm terribly sorry. All right. Okay. Okay. Well, you can read it all. I'm very sorry about that. I did start late. Sorry. Okay. I'm very sorry. There was a great deal on Iraq, but it's been laid out before, so I won't repeat that. There's a few pieces on the Iraqi program just here. That had me really confused for the moment. I would just wind up by saying that, if I may, I'll probably... Oh. And what you saw very, very quickly were just some weapons produced by Iraq. I won't bother to go through in detail. This is not working either. I knew this would be a nightmare. I was a nightmare slide, actually. In fact, where is my nightmare slide? I can't get this to go any further. I will tie up there and say that I would make just one tribute, and that is that none of this would have happened today without Vladimir Pasechnik coming out in 1989. He did a very brave thing. I know after that Ken Alibek came out and gave us a great deal of information, but without that step that occurred then, we wouldn't have had that watershed which allows us to go on to today. Maybe another time I'll have a chance to talk to you about Iraq and make one or two other points about the more advanced ideas of the Soviet program, which I was going to do, but we'll save that perhaps for another day, I suppose. It's a case of always leaving the audience begging for more. Well, I hope. Thank you. A bath here. I was looking for that. I didn't see it there.
Join us on the panel here. Yeah, I want to apologize for cutting you short. That's a fascinating presentation and a lot of information that I hope we'll be able to gain at another time. But in the interest of time and schedule, we're moving on, and it's going to be my pleasure to introduce Dr. Jessica Stern. Dr. Stern served on President Clinton's National Security Council staff as Director for Russian, Ukrainian, and Eurasian Affairs, chairing interagency groups on nuclear smuggling and nuclear security, and establishing the Nuclear Smuggling Response Group. If this sounds familiar to you at all, it might be because her role was fictionalized in the popular movie Peacekeeper, and was also the subject in a book called 1 Point Safe by the Coburns. Dr. Stern helped to oversee Project Sapphire. In that position, a secret operation to airlift 0.5 ton of vulnerable nuclear materials to safe storage in the United States. Prior to joining the NSC, Dr. Stern was a postdoctoral fellow at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, where she studied and analyzed political developments in Russia that might affect the security of nuclear weapons. Currently, she is a fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Stern is writing a book on terrorism and sabotage. She's already written one book on the subject, The Ultimate Terrorists, which is due out, she informs me, next week from Harvard Press, and she promised me faithfully I could keep this book. Dr. Stern.
Thank you very much, David. The traditional view has been that terrorists won't use weapons of mass destruction, including biological weapons, because to do so would be irrational. Terrorists, as Brian Jenkins said so famously, want a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead. They'd be deterred by the fear of public backlash, and that governments would crack down so harshly that the costs would outweigh the benefits. And some terrorists are clearly concerned by the morality. They have moral concerns about using such frightening and lethal weapons. I could give you some examples, but I won't in the interest of time. There's a new view. Biological agents can kill hundreds of thousands or even millions of people. This has been true for a long time. In the national security field, we're paying attention to nuclear weapons, not biological ones. And that terrorists can make these weapons in a bathtub. And that it's just a matter of time before terrorists, there's a major strike with biological weapons, perhaps over New York City. I'm going to try to persuade you that the truth is in the middle. Am I okay with it? Okay. The truth is really in between these two extremes. I actually am hoping that the other slide could be shown. Thank you very much. Candidates for using biological agents or weapons of mass destruction successfully are found at the intersection of three sets, and it's very important to bear this in mind. The terrorists have to want to use these weapons, and in my view, very few terrorists would want to because of the political and moral concerns that I mentioned earlier. They also have to be able to acquire biological agents, and we know from having seen Aum Shinrikyo's failed attacks that they may have acquired the wrong kind of agents. And they also need to be able to disseminate the agent covertly. There are three different types of things these terrorists have to be able to do, and the intersection of these three sets is small, but it's growing. Far more likely than the kind of nightmare scenarios that we've been hearing about are low technology attacks, like using cyanide to contaminate foods, like trying to poison Coca-Cola, Stolichnaya vodka, a symbol of the target country. When you think about what happened at Bhopal, you can see that low technology attacks involving industrial chemicals could be extremely lethal. It actually doesn't even matter whether Union Carbide is right that the Bhopal incident was a deliberate case of sabotage. It nonetheless demonstrates how lethal these relatively crude industrial chemicals could be. Nonetheless, it's clear that terrorists are increasingly interested in weapons of mass destruction, including biological agents. The FBI reports that it is now investigating around 100 cases per year. Yes. Okay, thank you very much. Prior to Aum Shinrikyo and the Oklahoma City bombing, they were investigating around a dozen per year. Recent cases include the Republic of Texas's very unusual plan to assassinate high-level as well as local officials with a modified cigarette lighter with cactus spikes, using a variety of biological agents. And Larry Harris acquired Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. There are a number of cases that make clear that this has become much more interesting to domestic extremists. And I've drawn up a chart here that shows the number of hoaxes that we've been seeing. Hoaxes with anthrax, hoaxes and threats are now very much in fashion. And one thing I think we really need to be concerned about is whether we in this community are contributing, whether we are frightening people, whether we are making these weapons seem more interesting, more glamorous, whether we are in part guilty for these hoaxes. I think that if any person is guilty more than any other, it would in fact be Larry Harris, when he has been disseminating information about biological agents on the internet, and he's targeting white supremacists, right-wing extremists, identity Christians. And he also, in February 1998, got a huge amount of press coverage because of his claim to an informant that he had so-called military-grade anthrax, and he could wipe out all of Las Vegas with the military-grade anthrax. We can see, if you, I actually, in your folders, you'll see a more complete listing of the threats and hoaxes. You can see that they increased dramatically after Larry Harris's February, after that February 1998 incident. And hoaxes can be extremely expensive and frightening. So it is a form of terrorism. If you can go back conceptually to the three sets I mentioned earlier, I started out by saying the first requirement is that the terrorist be able to acquire the weapon. And I'm not going to go into detail because David Segrist went into enough detail, I think. But the main point is that it is not as easy to disseminate biological agents as the popular media would have us believe. Let's consider some of the reasons why terrorists might want to use these weapons. And again, this is a small set, I believe, of terrorists, a small but growing set of terrorists. First of all, they might be trying to get more people watching. Psychologists have found that there are 18 variables associated with disproportionate dread. Biological agents have most of these attributes. They're mysterious, they're unknown, they're invisible, they're indiscriminate. They could have long-term impact. They're uncontrollable. So these are weapons that could really get attention, could really frighten people, even if the terrorists, in fact, didn't want to kill anyone. Also, these agents are more useful for carrying out acts of economic sabotage than our conventional weapons. They can be used to poison foodstuffs, crops, livestock. Examples include the Chilean grapes. That was a poison, obviously. The incidents that have occurred so far mostly involve chemical poisons, but biological poisons could also be used. And one example is the poisoning of salad bars by the Rajneeshi cult, causing 750 people to become ill with salmonella. Suppose we relax the assumption of substantive rationality, then we can imagine a large number of reasons why terrorists might find these weapons attractive. Religious extremists are growing in number. In 1968, of 11 international terrorist groups identified, none were religious. In 1995, a quarter of the international groups identified were religion-inspired, and they were responsible for 58% of the fatalities. This is according to the Rand St. Andrews database. Another reason, millenarianism. This is the idea that the present age is corrupt and that a new age will dawn and only a select few will survive. America, for some reason, is especially vulnerable to millenarian cults. There were the Millerites. There's Elizabeth Clare Prophet, for example, who claimed that the reason the world didn't end when she predicted is because her followers were praying so much that they averted this disaster. Some millenarians believe that they will need weapons to survive Armageddon, and they are stockpiling them for that reason. And these include identity Christians, who are increasingly, right-wing extremists are increasingly attracted to identity Christianity, which is a millenarian religion. Some believe they can persuade the Messiah to return more quickly if they carry out extreme acts of violence. And I've had the opportunity to interview someone who got out of jail after being involved in a plot to overthrow the U.S. government, but also they were plotting to poison major city water supplies with cyanide. And he explained to me that they believe they were carrying out God's judgments, that if they assisted God in carrying out those judgments, that the Messiah would return more quickly. Many people are affected by premillennial tensions. And for some of us, and when I say premillennial tension now, I'm not referring to a millenarian idea, I'm talking about the year 2000. Some of us worry about the many of us worry about the Y2K bug. Some of us are stockpiling food or thinking about having extra cash on hand. I think all of us feel a slight extra level of tension as a result of this fear that we have about the Y2K bug. But for domestic extremists and actually extremists around the world, they tend to be particularly vulnerable psychologically. And I think they are more affected by this fear of all those zeros and of the Y2K bug. I actually spoke again with Larry Harris last week, and he explained to me that he believes that America is held together by defective chips, and that on January 1, 2000, because welfare checks and food stamps will not be sent out, there will be a race war. He has been, as many of you know, until recently obsessed with Iraq's imminent strikes with biological weapons, and now he seems to be focused more on the Y2K bug. And this is a trend in the identity Christian and right-wing extremist community in the United States. Also, some terrorists might want to bring about chaos. William Pierce, the author of the Turner Diaries that inspired the Oklahoma City bombing, told me that American society is in a process of self-destruction. Society will descend into chaos or civil war, and speeding up that process, in his view, is in the interest of the country. And he also predicts the use of biological agents. Some terrorists might want to carry out acts of revenge. Obvious examples are Osama bin Laden and Ramzi Youssef and the World Trade Center bombers. Some want to mimic God. The fifth plague in the story of Exodus is murrain, which is a group of cattle diseases that includes anthrax. Some want to mimic Hitler. Aum Shinrikyo, which Kyle Olson will be speaking about, they were clearly attracted to the Nazi past of sarin, and there will probably be other terrorists who will be attracted to chemical agents because of this sort of whiff of the Nazi past. Others will want to mimic other terrorists, and we see this with the hoaxes, and we just have to hope that these hoaxes don't turn into real attempts to disseminate these weapons. And I think we all need to be very careful, especially those of us who are in the media, about how we cover this issue. It is really important not to say that anybody can make a biological weapon in a bathtub, in my view. I think that's needlessly scaring people. And some terrorists are attracted to the aura of science. These weapons seem more scientific. What about the organizational factors that I mentioned? It's not enough to acquire the agent. It's not enough to have the technical ability to disseminate it, but you have to be able to do it covertly. And there are very few domestic groups that would be able to do this. In fact, the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord, the group that wanted to poison major city water supplies, in the mid-1980s really failed, in my view, in part because of organizational factors. They didn't attract highly skilled members, and they were not secretive at all. They published their views widely, their anti-government views, and they were very easily penetrated by law enforcement authorities. But there is a trend that is very troubling, which is the concept of leaderless resistance, which is being promulgated by Louis Beam, who's a prominent neo-Nazi. The idea is that rather than forming closely knit groups, terrorists operatives take their inspiration from speeches or things they see on the web and act on their own. And William Pierce was following this kind of approach. I don't know that he had listened to Louis Beam and decided to work on his own as a result, but that is the kind of leaderless resistance that Louis Beam is hoping to see. And this obviously makes it far harder for law enforcement authorities to penetrate groups. In conclusion, broad trends in terrorist activities are very worrying. But low technology, small-scale efforts are far more likely. Thank you.
We'll now take a 20-minute coffee break. We're going to try and get back on schedule after those wonderful talks, and we'll start at 10:55 promptly. And two quick announcements. The first is that there are two messages on the message board outside. You may want to check that. And Judith English, please call your office.
Yes, sir. Hello, Doug. How are you? Doing well, sir. Yes.
As per protocol, just want you to know the doors in the back are fire exits or whatever. To say, I've been asked just to say that the exits to the audience's left and behind are all working doors.
And well, what's the what's your okay? Thank you very much. I've been asked to make a logistical announcement. Just want to remind everybody that there are exits both around in the back and through here in case there was some sort of emergency. So there are working exits behind as well as in front there. It's now my pleasure to introduce Kyle Olson. Kyle B. Olson is a leading authority on high technology terrorism, the threat of chemical and biological weapons, and the practical challenges of arms control. Mr. Olson is a special projects manager for Research Planning Incorporated, where he designs chemical and biological terrorism response exercises for cities across the United States. Mr. Olson was the first Western expert to investigate the unprecedented June 1994 terrorist use of nerve gas at Matsumoto, Japan. His report, issued in both Japan and the United States in December '94, predicted further such attacks were likely and specifically pointed out the vulnerability of the Tokyo subway system to a weapon like sarin. Following Shinrikyo's poison gas attack on the Tokyo subway in March 1995, Mr. Olson spent extensive time in Japan investigating both the incident and the cult. It's our pleasure and privilege today to have Mr. Olson to address us on this pseudo-religious cult. Kyle.
Good morning. I think like the other speakers, I'm a little bit overwhelmed by the turnout. Again, having expected to attend a rather intimate little coffee clutch, as these things have tended to be over the last 10 years or so. So it's rather gratifying that you wanted to turn out and see what little old me and my colleagues had to say. Thank you. This morning, I'm going to spend some time taking a look at Aum Shinrikyo. I've been asked to look at Aum Shinrikyo from the point of view of whether or not they actually pose a current threat or a future threat. I think what I want to do, though, also is use it as a point of departure to take a look at other questions that I think have been raised rather capably by the other speakers this morning, and perhaps leave you with something that goes beyond just taking a look at a religious group in Japan. Let's start by reviewing some of the facts. On June 27, 1994, a Sunday evening in the city of Matsumoto, a city of about 300,000 people, a couple hundred miles outside of Tokyo, warm June evening, a group drove a converted refrigerated truck, equipped much like this one, into a residential neighborhood. Once they got in that neighborhood, they activated a computer-controlled system which released sarin into a preheating chamber, then in turn released it as an aerosol. The neighborhood in question was, like many neighborhoods, a neighborhood really very nondescript in many respects. Some private homes, a couple of high-rise apartment buildings, some townhomes, a small dormitory. Of particular significance this morning, however, this evening, was that in that dormitory lived 3 judges who were about to hand down a decision involving a real estate dispute in which the religious extremist group Aum Shinrikyo was the defendant, a decision which was expected to go against the cult. The group pulled into a parking lot adjacent to the neighborhood, activated their device, released a cloud of sarin, an aerosol cloud of sarin, into what was essentially a courtyard created by those buildings. A relatively light wind, 3 to 5 knots. Sarin's heavier than air, but even a light breeze in a closed courtyard will set something swirling, much like leaves on an autumn day. And so it was that the agent permeated a number of buildings, went in through windows, doorways, various entrances. And within a fairly short period of time, there were 7 people dead. There were almost 500 people that required transport to local hospitals, of whom about 200 would require at least one night's hospitalization. After successfully completing their mission, the cultists drove off. They returned to a place called Kamakuishiki. Kamakuishiki is a rural community at the foot of Mount Fuji, golf courses, some parks, dairy farms, some small towns. It also happens to constitute the headquarters of Aum Shinrikyo in Japan. A number of motley buildings, factories, dormitories. We jump ahead in time to March 20, 1995, the event that for most of the world was the wake-up call regarding the prospects of weapons of mass destruction and terrorism. On that morning, at approximately 8 o'clock in the morning, packages were placed on 5 different subway trains in the Tokyo subway system. Packages consisted of plastic bags filled with chemical mix wrapped in turn inside newspapers. Packages were punctured with an umbrella. The material was allowed to spill out onto the floor of the subway car. The liquid moved, the vapors from the evaporation moved and spread throughout the car, causing a remarkable series of events. This was that morning in Tokyo, as it was played out around the world. This was a coordinated, simultaneous, multi-point attack. Many times we I think in the process of considering what the nature of WMD terrorism will be, step back and think of find ourselves in the lone gunman or the lone weapon mentality. In fact, this was a coordinated attack. The attack was carried out within moments at 5 different locations in the world's largest city. They were placed on 5 trains, all of them converging on the center of Tokyo. They would have attacked 6 trains, but they didn't have enough agent. As a result, you had fatalities and injuries throughout Tokyo. This was what it was like that morning. The first reports came from the inner suburbs, and then very quickly, the reports trickled in from station after station, all of them centering at the station at Kasumigaseki, the station which serves, among other things, the federal headquarters of the Japanese government. Most of the major ministries,
The Ministry of the Interior, Ministry of International Trade and Industry, the Foreign Ministry, Defense Ministry, as well as the National Police Agency have their headquarters at Kasumigaseki. By the end of that day, 15 different subway stations in the world's busiest subway system had been affected. Of these, the stations along the Hibiya line were the heaviest affected. Some of them had 200, 300, 400 victims. Total number of injured, just under 3,800. You've seen the number 5,500 that's been reported for many years now. Seems like many years. It's only been a little more than 4 years, hasn't it? Not even. But the actual number is just under 3,800. Of those 3,800, 1,000 actually required hospitalization, some for no more than a few hours, some for many days, some are still hospitalized. And of course, there were 12 people dead or dying. Within 48 hours, police were carrying out raids against cult facilities throughout Japan. This is a shot taken at the cult's headquarters at Kamakuishiki. These are Japanese police. They are wearing military-issued chemical gear. Interestingly enough, and a story we don't have time for right now, chemical gear issued to the Tokyo police the week before the subway attack. They came in with a variety of equipment. They came in with military-issued protective gear, detection systems. They had canaries in cages. They were taking no chances. In fact, they even brought along reporters who didn't have any protective equipment as a fallback measure. You take, one of the lessons is you improvise. You make use of what you've got at hand. The real target of the raids that began on March 17th was the building known as Satyan 7. Satyan 7 was ostensibly a shrine to the Hindu god Shiva, Shiva the destroyer, Shiva the most prominent figure in the Om Shinrikyo religious pantheon. But it was also a full-blown chemical weapons production facility designed by cult engineers, equipped with first-rate gear purchased through both open purchases over the counter as well as from sources. For example, one cult member owned a small chemical company. He was able to acquire equipment for the cults as well. Now, chemical engineers have looked at photographs similar to this one, which was taken by an Italian photojournalist who snuck through the police lines, and have said it's a rather Rube Goldberg-esque design. Nonetheless, it was a facility that was capable of producing the sarin used in the Matsumoto incident. Ultimately, there was an accident which forced them to have to put the plant in mothballs for a time. They actually tried to recruit Russian chemical scientists in order to get the plant up and running. See, they were very adept at recruiting educated professionals, scientists, engineers, but these were young, largely inexperienced professionals. They could build it, but they couldn't make it run. And that, as it turns out, was extremely good news because this facility was designed to produce sarin not on a terrorist scale, but on the order of thousands of kilograms a year. That's almost military scale. You can see reactors in the foreground here. You can see a distillation column in the background. Giving you a sense of scale, it's about 12 to 15 feet tall. Cult also played in the field of biological weapons, and actually the word also is misleading. It should be noted that the cult's leader, Shoko Asahara's first weapon of mass destruction, first weapon of choice, was biological weapons. In fact, his interest in biological weapons seems to stem from around the period 1989-1990, and at least in part was spurred by his fascination with what he was seeing on CNN as it covered the preparations for the war in the Gulf. He saw the greatest military force in the world taking extreme precautions against the prospects of a third-rate country's use of biological weapons. In fact, the first cult laboratory for toxin production was actually in place by 1990. It was subsequently replaced with two new laboratories, one at Kamakuishiki and the other actually in Tokyo itself. We know they dabbled in a lot of different agents. We know they played with Botox, anthrax, cholera, Q fever. And in 1993, Asahara himself, along with a group of 16 cult doctors and nurses, went to Zaire on ostensibly a medical mission of mercy. What in fact that mission was an attempt to learn as much about, and ideally to bring back samples of the Ebola virus. In fact, in early 1994 on Russian radio, cult doctors were quoted as talking about the possibility of using Ebola as a biological weapon. This, by the way, is a diagram of the cult's rudimentary laboratory circa 1990. fact, in early 1994 on Russian radio, cult doctors were quoted as talking about the possibility of using Ebola as a biological weapon. This, by the way, is a diagram of the cult's rudimentary laboratory circa 1990. I won't go into a lot of detail there other than to illustrate what you can do when you have resources at your disposal. That laboratory was subsequently knocked down and a new one put in its place, in fact, right behind Satyan 7. That building was, in fact, used also to produce the nerve agent which was used in the Tokyo subway attack. This is a brief clip showing some of the equipment inside that laboratory. It's a segment from a much longer clip done by the Japanese police and then released to the media there. As has been mentioned before, biological terrorism did take place in Japan, though apparently unsuccessfully. As early as April 1990, the cult had tried to release botulinum toxin from a vehicle driving around the Diet building and other government buildings in central Tokyo. In early June of '93, once again an attempt was made to release bot tox, this time in conjunction with the wedding of the Crown Prince. And this time they were driving around the Imperial Palace as well as the main government buildings. Later that month, the cult attempted to release anthrax spores from the office building which housed their biolaboratory in Tokyo itself. There were reports at that time of foul smells, brown steam, some pet deaths, stains on cars and sidewalks, that sort of thing. And then in March '95, in an abortive attempt that was essentially preempted by a cult member who opted not to fill the payload with the actual agent, briefcases were placed in the subway at Kasumigaseki Station. These were designed to release botulinum toxin into the environment in the subway. It's worth noting that there are no reports of any injuries from any of these biological events, despite the fact that they were dealing with events with materials that pop up to the top of anybody's hit list. Now, it's been suggested that a variety of things. Maybe they didn't have the right agents, maybe they didn't have the right technologies, maybe they overcooked them, maybe they didn't know how to weaponize them. All of these are probably true. The cult was not terribly successful at recruiting biological scientists. On the other hand, the cult was very successful at throwing money at problems. It's entirely possible that there were casualties associated with some of these releases, accidental casualties, inadvertent casualties, small numbers, certainly no kill-off. But I would also argue that at this point in time, given the embarrassment Japan suffered from the incident in the subway and Matsumoto, there's not a terrific institutional imperative to go back and find accidental flu deaths from 5 or 10 years ago. Cult scope was worldwide, operations literally around the world, a theology that drew from a mishmash of sources. Again, very successful at recruiting members with good educations. Total membership around the world, maybe 20,000, 30,000, 40,000. Estimates as high as 60, I think, are a little irresponsible. Cult was very wealthy. Estimated at the time of the subway attack by one cult leader as having a net worth of about $1.5 billion. How'd they make their money? Donations, tithing. They sold equipment, they sold videotapes, books to members. They also conducted seminars and had training courses for members in which the members were indoctrinated in the cult way. And these people ended up paying between hundreds and tens of thousands of dollars for the privilege of attending these sessions. Cult also had a number of commercial enterprises. Among other things, they manufactured computers. They imported components from Taiwan, assembled them at Kamakuishiki, sold them in their own stores in downtown Tokyo. Very popular machines, by the way. They were very competitively priced, came with a lot of software, all of it pirated. But you see, they were able to pass the savings on to the customer, and that was a tremendous attraction. They ran a chain of restaurants, noodle shops in Tokyo and other cities. Cult practiced green mail. They would threaten to establish a compound in a city, and if the city didn't pay them money to go away, they'd do it. A number of cities actually paid up rather than have the cult establish operations there. They manufactured illegal drugs under an agreement with the Japanese mafia, the Yakuza. In fact, the Yakuza was responsible for the assassination of the cult's lead scientist in the days after the Tokyo subway attack because he was perceived as talking too much. And of course, extortion, theft, and murder were also part of the package. Nothing like recruiting a little old lady to the cult, making sure the will is changed, and then seeing that she disappears. They are once again looking for donations, collecting tithes, selling materials to members, holding seminars, conducting training, and they are once again selling computers. Among the cult leaders, Shoko Asahara and Hideo Murai are viewed as being primary villains, but there's another man I want to talk about very briefly, a man by the name of Joyu. First of all, Shoko Asahara. Born Chizuo Matsumoto, venerated master, holy yogi, pope, leader of the pack, whatever you want to call it, highly charismatic, partially blind, apparently a very talented yoga instructor before the high living of being the leader of the cult got to him. Very politically, financially ambitious. In fact, he actually ran for parliament in 1989 and 90, along with 24 of his other members. They were soundly defeated, which some Japanese analysts have suggested marks the moment in time when the cult elected to pursue weapons of mass destruction, violent overthrow of the established order. Has on many occasions referred to himself as the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, and while he is the son of a carpenter, that's about as far as I think we want to go with that. Talked about millennialism. Well, Asahara talked about the coming Armageddon, a great global conflict which would, among other things, destroy Japan with nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. Only survivors? Aum Shinrikyo. And it's also very clear that he was involved in the day-to-day operations of the cult. He was a hands-on manager. None of that delegation for him. He would identify individuals and tell them where they were going to work. Another man of interest is a man by the name of Fumihiro Joyu. Now, Fumihiro Joyu was an engineer with the Japanese space program. He left that organization to come to work for Aum, where he very quickly rose through the ranks. He was trained in artificial intelligence. That's what his degree is in. He's a rather smart fellow. He's about 35 now. He was very quickly elevated to head the cult's operations in Russia, an investment on the cult's part of about $12 million in putting money in the right people's hands, which successfully resulted in their achieving access to office buildings, dormitories, and other facilities throughout Russian cities, through about a half dozen Russian cities. They actually had a joint venture at the time of the Tokyo subway attack called the Moscow Japan University, which was located in offices across the street from the Bolshoi Ballet, and which the Russian executive officer was a man by the name of Oleg Lobov, at that time also chairman of the Russian National Security Council. He was an extraordinarily successful recruiter and a man who received an extremely light sentence, only about 3 years, for his involvement in the cult's activities. In fact, there is some indication that he's received some special treatment over the years. He was allowed, for example, to adopt his 35-year-old lieutenant so that as his son, they would be able to communicate back and forth on a regular basis. Joyu has apparently maintained close ties to the cult. He's slated for release towards the end of this year, and it's highly likely he's going to make a play for leadership. He's certainly the most charismatic member of the cult, other than Asahara. In fact, in the days right after the Tokyo subway attack, he was on Japanese television so much and in the magazines and newspapers so much that he actually became a teen heartthrob. Japanese magazines for teenage girls ran headlines such as, "Joyu-san, be my boyfriend." Well, girls, he's coming. This is on the current Aum Shinrikyo webpage. First of all, note that it is in Russian, Aum Shinrikyo. Note the picture of someone wearing a chemical mask. Nostradamus is a very prominent prophet to Aum Shinrikyo, and Nostradamus is a sort of dark prophet. And of course, our friend Joyu is very close to the man himself in that picture. Situation today, first of all, right after the gas attack, more than 200 key members of the cult were arrested. About 120 are still in jail or on trial or have even been convicted. Asahara himself is on trial. He's been on trial for about 3 years. It's estimated he'll be on trial for about another 6 or 7 years. It's moving along pretty fast. That is fast by Japanese standards, actually. There are still 3 members who were involved in the attack who are at large. Russian operations were ended by legal action, so that situation no longer exists. The church status of the cult was removed, but many of the assets are unaccounted for, and as noted before, there are efforts underway to resurrect the cult. Active recruiting is underway. They're still holding about 50 seminars a month. They have offices throughout Japan, around Tokyo, and other locations. They have about 100 hideouts throughout Japan, according to Japanese sources, where at least 700 members are live-in, fully committed devotees. They're back in the computer business. I mentioned that before. They're expecting to make about $30 million on their computers this year. And they're buying real estate around Japan, and interestingly enough, also right around the jail where Asahara is held. The cult is still preaching its hate message. It's still teaching the notion of salvation through murder. You can help some wicked soul on to the next life, and you will be doing them a favor. It's a rather perverse definition of Buddhist belief. Potential for martyring Asahara. If he is convicted and condemned to death, he will fulfill one of his own prophecies. Mind control is still part of the package. You still see cult members in the compounds walking around wearing these bizarre little electric headsets that are designed to synchronize their brainwaves with the cult leader. But I guess where I want to go in terms of summing up and wrapping up is that I think this might miss the real point. It's all well to look at Aum Shinrikyo and say, good God, what is the message here? Well, keep in mind this. The objective of the Tokyo subway attack was not irrational by any means. Their objective that day was to kill as many policemen as possible. They wanted to kill policemen because the policemen were getting ready to start raids against cult facilities. And the cult timetable did not permit that sort of interruption. Aum's actions were perfectly logical within the context of their value system. They were a self-legitimized group that rejected and ultimately had to confront the society they were a part of. In fact, since they were outnumbered, you can argue that an asymmetric response was the only logical one for them. They concluded that they were not going to be able to do anything legitimately, therefore they needed power in order to make that happen. So when the imminent police action was threatened against them, they had to strike out. That's the way it made sense to them. And the collateral damage was irrelevant. At Kasumigaseki, just as it was at Kobar Towers, just as it was in Oklahoma City. In the tea leaves, it's been pointed out before, the technologies are being broadly diffused to individuals and groups. Just as nuclear weapons legitimize nations' claims to great power status, so too do WMD weapons legitimize the claims of subnational groups, terrorist groups, individuals. If you can sufficiently demonize your enemies, and you are under sufficient pressure, then bioterrorism becomes a very real, very rational element in your list of choices. And it's not just overseas, it's at home as well, as was pointed out earlier this morning. So the question is, was Shoko Asahara just the first of many? Or has he been relegated to the scrap heap? I think it's an open question, and unfortunately it's one that we have to spend time grappling with. I appreciate your attention and your attendance here this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. That was disturbing talk. Our next paper was authored by Jonathan Tucker. Dr. Tucker is research professor and director of the Chemical and Biological Weapons Non-Proliferation Project at the Center for Non-Proliferation Studies of the Monterey Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California. He has worked at the Office of Technology Assessment, where he helped to author the chapters in their magisterial studies on weapons of mass destruction. He was an advisor for the U.S. government to The Hague on arms control. He was an inspector in Iraq. Unfortunately, Dr. Tucker was forced to cancel his speaking engagement here due to a medical emergency, not life-threatening, but medical emergency. In his place, we're fortunate to have Jason Pate, a research associate for the study on weapons of mass destruction terrorism at the Institute, who works closely with Dr. Tucker on these issues. Mr. Pate holds a bachelor's in international relations from Stanford and a master of public management from the School of Public Affairs of the University of Maryland. Prior to joining the Chemical Biological Weapons Project in Monterey in February 1997, Mr. Pate was a research assistant for the Science and Technology Committee at the North Atlantic Assembly in Brussels. Will you help welcome Mr. Pate?
Thank you, David. I share with my colleagues a deep sense of gratitude for the opportunity to speak before you today, this very renowned and very large group of people. Unfortunately, the circumstances under which I'm here are not the best. Jonathan Tucker asked me to convey his deep regret that he was unable to come due to a medical emergency recently, and he sends his warm regards to all of you. Today I'm talking about historical trends related to bioterrorism, an empirical analysis. Since the Aum Shinrikyo incidents, there has been an increase in terrorist incidents involving chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear materials, or CBRN materials. Until the late 1990s, the FBI investigated approximately a dozen such incidents per year. In 1997, that jumped to 71. In 1998, 146. This year already, over 100 investigations have been opened. Although 80% of these have proven to be hoaxes, some incidents reportedly did involve attempted release or attempted acquisition of infectious agents. Particularly in the U.S., anthrax hoaxes have become very popular. As of early this month, over 35 anthrax hoaxes were reported in Southern California, and nationwide the number is closer to 200. One possible cause is the sensational coverage this topic has seen in the media, in popular novels, in television programs, and other movies. The U.S. government has appropriated billions of dollars to respond to this threat, but thus far the focus has been on the vulnerability of cities and assets to large-scale attacks, rather than trying to understand the threat. The questions we're trying to answer are: what types of terrorist groups or individuals are most likely to acquire these agents? And if so, what agents would they most likely seek to acquire or use? A number of analysts have speculated on these questions, and a lot of that speculation has been based on a priori assumptions about looking at the vulnerability of cities and looking at the capabilities that seem to be available to a number of groups and individuals. We at the Monterey Institute are seeking to fill this gap and provide a better understanding of the threat, and one of the ways we've done this is we've amassed a database of incidents worldwide from 1900 to the present. Currently there are 415 incidents in the database. Now these incidents, here go my caveats, these incidents are drawn from open source materials, predominantly newspaper reports. There have been some primary source interviewing for a number of the more cited incidents, but generally this is a compilation of open source newspaper reports and press coverage of incidents this century. To look at figure 1, this gives a distribution of the entire database, all 415 incidents. You'll note that the vast majority of incidents have been involved chemical or biological agents. Of the biological cases, 66 were criminally motivated, 55 had some sort of political or ideological motivation, and 16 were state-sponsored assassinations. Of these 415 cases, we selected 151 for analysis because these both contained enough information to warrant analysis and were motivated primarily by political or ideological goals. Of these 151 cases, 33 involved biological agents. Looking at the next slide, it's a breakdown of the typology for the cases. We're looking at motivation primarily, whether or not they're criminally motivated, politically or ideologically motivated, or if they are an assassination by a state-sponsored group. Turning to the next slide, looking at the distribution of event type. Most of the incidents that we analyzed involved the threat or actual use of agents, and there's a disproportionate, if I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. The top slide, you'll note that the large columns are threats and actual incidents of cases, and on the second portion of the slide, break out biological agents only, and there is where we see the hoaxes and pranks. Moving to the next slide. Looking at how the type of event has changed over time, there is a suggestion in the data that the use, attempted use, or threat to use CBRN materials has increased dramatically since 1985. For the next slide, please. Actual incidents plotted with hoaxes. There is a noticeable increase in both hoaxes and incidents. There is a peak at 1995 for OHM and OHM copycat-related incidents. For the second half of the slide, looking at hoaxes over time, there is a significant spike in chemical hoaxes for the second round of Tylenol poisonings in the United States in 1986, and a dramatic spike in anthrax hoaxes, biological hoaxes, in recent months. If we could have the next slide, please. Omitting individual terrorists, looking at the way types of groups have changed over time. There's been a rise in three categories of groups. One, single-issue groups, abortion or anti-abortion activists, nationalist separatist organizations like the PKK or Chechen rebels, as well as new religious groups, although in our data, most of these are OHM and OHM copycat related. If I could have the next slide, please. Splitting out the bio cases from that set, there is a very small number of them. There is no clear pattern. However, religious fundamentalism does seem to have appeared in the last 5 years. Once again, however, that is mostly OHM related. Moving on to the next slide, please. The choice of target over time has also changed. There is apparently an increase in the desire to inflict indiscriminate casualties. The data really doesn't show a significant increase in the desire to inflict mass casualties, however. There has also been an increase in the desire to hit representations of governments or organizations, symbolic buildings and other symbolic targets. For bio cases, there is no clear pattern. In the next slide, there is a distribution of motivations and objectives. We see four predominant motivations. One, nationalist separatist motivations. Another, revenge or retaliation for a real or perceived injury. Third, to protest government policies in general. And fourth, to protect the rights of animals. The obvious example is the Animal Liberation Front and their multitude of tactics involving these agents. The next slide shows the same distribution of motivations in bio cases. It's a similar breakdown, but there is a greater predominance of apocalyptic prophecy. Once again, these are OHM related. In the next slide, we've looked at how motivations have changed over time. From 1965 to 1989, the predominant motivation was to protest governments. Since 1990, there has been a move for revenge or retaliation and national separatist objectives. In 1993, apocalyptic prophecy and new religious terrorism sprang up, once again, predominantly OHM related. The last slide that I have today is actually one more, like the very, very last one that I have. There, thank you. Is a chart, obviously probably illegible to most of you in the room. It's actually illegible to me right now, which doesn't help me a lot, but it is, it's a breakdown of 7 of the most often cited biological cases, incidents of terrorism. This is from a forthcoming compilation of incidents that Dr. Tucker has overseen. There are several factors that do seem to be common among these incidents. The existence of charismatic leadership, the lack of an outside constituency, a link to apocalyptic ideology or belief community, a splinter or faction of a larger group that is operating, a sense of superiority, grandiosity, paranoia, and predominantly a posture of defensive aggression. All right, gone through a lot of slides very rapidly. Unfortunately, probably most of you were unable to see them. But in conclusion, let me put together some of our tentative findings for the project. We found that terrorism involving biological agents is extremely rare. From 1960 to the present, there have been 66 criminal cases and 33 political or ideological cases. However, the cases do seem to have increased in frequency. However, that might be explainable by the media attention given to biological terrorism today that simply might be appearing more in open source materials. The incidents are diverse in terms of type of event, type of group, motivation of the incident, and type of agent. And among political or ideological incidents, the trend has been away from traditional left-wing terrorism towards nationalist separatist groups or individuals seeking revenge or retaliation for a grievance. Most religiously motivated incidents are related to Aum, and this is really the big question that I have, is whether or not Aum is a trendsetter, a watershed event, or if it is an outlier in the analysis. It's very hard to tell. Obviously, my hope is that it's an outlier. These terrorists have diffuse objectives and tend to share a conspiratorial worldview. They do lack a constituency or other moderating influences that might restrain them from using or advocating the use of violence either indiscriminately or discriminately. And religious groups tend to be cut off from society. They're dissociated from societal norms. They follow prophecy or other divine inspiration, which may not hold up to rational analysis. And the leader may be charismatic and able to persuade those in his or her group to perpetrate actions that they otherwise would not have sought to do. Another conclusion is that very few people possess the know-how, technically, or the funding to carry off a successful biological terrorist attack. And therefore, at least in the near term, the most likely types of attacks will be very small-scale, low-tech attacks or hoaxes designed to achieve another likely tactical objective. However, in the medium to long term, the continued diffusion of dual-use technology and the existence of a vast network of expertise, both from the former Soviet Union and the South African biological weapons programs, does show that the more and more technology and technical capability is becoming more and more available to more people. So that is simply the case. Now, that's all I have to say today. Thank you very much for your time, and bye.
Thank you very much, Jason. That was great. Now is the time when we can entertain your questions. I'd like to thank all the panel members for their enlightening talks and about a fascinating topic. We have associates amongst you who have wireless microphones. I'd ask that if you would like to draw their attention to you, would you hold up your hand and I'll kind of indicate you when they get you the microphone. And I ask that you identify yourself, your organization, and the person to whom you'd like to address your question. We do have some lights here, and it's tough for me to see, but I'll see what I can do. Did I see one back there?
Carl Fleermans, Department of Energy. I'd like to address this to Dr. Davis. I enjoyed your talk. I'd like to hear the rest of it. Would you discuss your last slide for us, please?
Could I have it? Is it possible to?
The microphones are on there.
No, yes, no. Could I have the slide?
Yes, I'll be brief, if that's at all possible. I've never knowingly been brief in my life, unfortunately. The comments it really made were these. I got to the end of explaining about the former Soviet Union Russian problem, and obviously times moved on. Things have changed. The political system has changed. The financial system has changed. The economy is in a very bad way. There's been a complete reorganization of what's going on. So clearly the kind of picture I was painting is not the one that exists today. Indeed, there have been many efforts based, many of them in the United States, to try and turn around the Biopreparat system, civilianize it if you like, which is actually quite difficult, to turn its entire weapons program in the direction of more useful humanitarian things. Now, so people could legitimately say, well, it's all over then, isn't it? Ah, it's done. I mean, and it is absolutely typical that you get a sort of broad reaction to things when you've finally identified the problem and tackled it. But we never succeeded in really tackling the problem. First of all, they never really admitted that they were doing anything terribly wrong. They, in reply to submissions by the United States, United Kingdom, which were about an inch thick on their past programs. I mean, in respect to the United States, here's a program that finished in 1969, a document which took a year to research. All that exchange was done. I think we got about 6 pages from the Russians, and that's it. So the negotiations really ran into the sand, and I think everybody was left with a very unpleasant feeling at the end of the day. So you could say that yes, Biopreparat is nothing like it was. It doesn't do what it did. It's not in the structure it was. What happened to the people? Well, part of the worry there is that they didn't have any money to put any bread in their mouths, so would they be lured away to other countries' programs? And certainly there are worries there. What happened to the senior people? Oh, that's wonderful. They put a different hat on and stayed doing what they were always doing. Like the old song of the Vicar of Bray, when the king changed or the political system changed, so they changed their views. So that's rather a worry, because it was, it's a question of gamekeepers and poachers. Also, we then look back. If we begin to say that that Biopreparat's been degraded, what happened to the military program? The military program essentially we know relatively little about. The structure is still there. There is the feeling that much of what was going on in Biopreparat has in fact retreated into the woodwork of the old MOD program. What happened to all the plans? They didn't just disappear. There were detailed plans of how to do things and what to do with them in terms of weapons. What happened to all the seed cultures? None of this has ever been resolved. It's as if a veil should now be drawn over it and we must move on. Well, that's fine, let's clean the slate and get on, but I'm waiting for the clean slate. So the last thing I would say is the projects that were very curious indeed, and that we never really got answers from. And I would make one comment about that in particular, was some things said by Boris Yeltsin when he first began to talk about this, just after he took over power, when he spoke to the British Foreign Secretary, and he referred to scientists who'd worked on the influence of various substances on human genes, quote unquote, they would be transferred to genetics work on livestock breeding. This was raised at the time, but the whole idea was poo-pooed. People said he got it wrong, he'd been confused. He's been confused a number of times, so there was plenty of ammunition for the detractors. But it really does, there's more to it, one suspects, than that. There are feelings or information that go over many, many years about the so-called ethnic weapon, and might these comments be to do with that? And secondly, the possibility of what I've termed a sleeper weapon. In other words, the kind of molecules that you can infiltrate, attach to DNA, leave for a number of years, and then infiltrate an activator, which then switches on a gene or switches off another, and has a variety of effects anywhere between death, change in fertility, or things like this. Now, I admit this all sounds like science fiction to you and just beyond the capability at present or ever. But I have to say that such criticisms of science fiction were leveled when we were simply talking about large quantities of anthrax. So I just think there are worries about that we really need to keep in the back of our mind. It's all very well to deal with real problems of today, but we also have to think about the ones coming up.
Thank you, Christopher. I'm glad you got a chance to talk about that very important point. Are there other questions? I see one right here.
Yes, Aaron Budgore, Science Applications International Corporation. This question applies to both Dr. Davis and Mr. Olson. On the case of an incident where the population of the country may be affected itself, whether it's indigenous to the Soviet Union, Iraq, or perhaps in Japan, what countermeasures were these governments as well as individuals employing or thinking about that would not impact their own people?
Well, in the context of Japan, first of all, you have to recognize that the revelations regarding the cult's use of biological weapons actually came out well after the Tokyo subway attack with the sarin. So there was really no recognition. I mean, it's the classic case of a biological terrorist attack having been carried out and no one noticing. In this case, no one died, or apparently no one died, and therefore there was no triggering event. And certainly we'll discuss that later in today and tomorrow. But so there was no massive plan. There was no emergency response plan in place. In terms of dealing with the large-scale chemical incidents, particularly the one in Tokyo, there was an inspired series of improvisations on the part of the Tokyo medical community, to some extent working with, and in some cases working in spite of, the Tokyo law enforcement and military communities. There was just a remarkable degree of professionalism on the part of the medical staff, so they were able to recognize and share information as quickly as they were developing it. But again, on the biological side, there was really no anticipation, there was no recognition, and there was no response.
With respect to the former Soviet Union, yes, is the answer. Briefly, they had anticipated either military casualties or civilian casualties at some point, and the other half of the military program would have been, indeed was, still is, a defensive program. It had nothing like the emphasis and kudos of the offensive program, because that's the way the Russians think. But it was certainly in place, and they had the kind of extensive reporting system throughout the country that you might, wish to have in any country. Plus the development of much more advanced techniques for detection and reporting of any possible attack. So the answer is yes, there was an infrastructure there.
I know Bill Patrick has said that on the offensive side it takes about a year to develop a good agent and about 10 years to develop a good vaccine against it in certain cases. What other questions we have right here?
My name is Vincent Lydiard. I work for Battelle at Dugway Proving Ground, West Desert Test Center in Utah. I'll point my questions to Jessica Stern and Christopher Davis, but if anyone has anything to like to contribute. My question is that of awareness. It seems to be that public awareness is a bit of a two-edged sword. It enables, with increased awareness, to have greater funding in this area, but also there seems to be the propensity to have increased hoaxes. Does this cry of wolf dilute our abilities to be able to respond, or becoming desensitized to that? And there is also these three circles you talked about, two of them being the ability to acquire agent and also the ability to use it. It seems that the tool of a hoax needs neither of those, simply the willingness to be able to use that. Is that hoax then being an effective tool to be able to strike fear in the hearts of men, or whatever it may be, to be able to do this? And I'm just curious about what your feelings about that would be.
Yes, I think on your second question, I think you're absolutely right that all that's required for a hoax apparently is a willingness to carry it out. And it is extremely troubling, and there is this very, very difficult trade-off between making the public aware of this threat and justifying increased funding to fight it, and the possibility that we do inspire hoaxes. I don't have an answer, I'm afraid. I think it is very, very difficult. I think we have to be careful, that's all. And I think another thing I would point out is we all need to be aware when we are speaking and thinking about this threat that it's more important than anything else that everybody wear seatbelts. I said that to someone who asked me a question. In terms of the threat to individuals, an individual is far more likely to have a car accident on the way home than to be struck with a biological agent. I think when we talk to the public, it's important to make that clear. For a government, you have to think about threats that would target large numbers of people all at once, and the government's response, in my view, is absolutely appropriate. We must prepare for the possibility of a major biological attack, even if it's not highly likely. We must prepare for it. But when we speak to people who are thinking about their own safety, it's important to point out that it isn't something that should keep them up at night.
I couldn't agree more there. The thing is that the pendulum has swung, and it's a good thing that it has. As I pointed out earlier in my talk, there was a time when you could not persuade anybody that this was a problem, either from the state point of view or the bioterrorism point of view, and that's the importance of today. Pendulums have to swing. It'll go back again slightly. Awareness has to be raised, even if it does bring with it these problems. I think I agree with Jessica completely there, because you then have to have knowledge, and it's important that you do convey to the public some idea of risk assessment. As you say, it's like far more likely that you get killed through cigarette smoking or an automobile accident than you are from a biological weapon. But if the biological weapon happens, if that incident happens, the downstream effect is potentially enormous, and therefore that singular action has to be planned for. I think the other point to make is that the similar thing has happened on the microbiological side with public health. Simple people's awareness of public health. Those people who grew up in our previous generation to us, who grew up in a world where infectious disease was a big problem, all right? People, died, regularly from infectious diseases, were aware of it. That's where public health systems came into being. And it's almost like the public have got blasé about that. They simply think that everything can be cured by an antibiotic. This is a particular example of that kind of situation.
I'd like to just add one thing, if I could. I think we have to recognize that a little bit of hysteria can be a good thing. It's filled this room today. It has generated hundreds of millions of dollars in funding that was never there before. And let's also be very candid, if hundreds of millions of dollars in funding were not there, this room would also probably not be full. But beyond that, the issue is there. If the threat is real, even if the threat, as Sam Nunn once said, it constitutes a situation where the likelihood of any one city being attacked is negligible, but the probability of someone being attacked is inevitable, then this is a worthwhile prospect. However, the point you make regarding the cry wolf syndrome, the notion of the hoaxes, one of the things that worries me about the hoaxes is that they are happening with such rapidity, such frequency now. I mean, it has become the flavor of the month, if not the flavor of the week. The city of Los Angeles, in fact, has had so many hoaxes, so it's become an almost everyday thing, that in talking with law enforcement professionals in LA, they are now literally reaching the point where they are taking anthrax threats for granted. I think we are seeing, at least in that particular instance, a lowering of our regard. Because it can cost $100,000 or more to respond with full kit and full equipment and full personnel to one of these things. That is daunting, and I think you're already seeing a ramping back, the development of so-called new protocols for use in essentially sifting the grain from the chaff. The danger, obviously, is that we're going to miss some of the grain.
Very important. We have a question over on the side. If you wait for the mic, it'll be right there.
I just wanted to follow up on the last question that was asked, and anyone on the panel is welcome to take it.
And your name?
Audrey Taylor with ABC News. Do we think that biological terrorism is now the new threat, the new terrorism? Is that the message we're trying to get out to the general public? and anyone can take it.
I think it's part of the new terrorism. Terrorism has changed. There used to be a very nice, simple definition of terrorism. I mean, the people that worked for the Soviet Union were terrorists, and our people were freedom fighters. That definition broke down a few years ago along with the Soviet Union. There are some of the rules that were in place that restrained the action of groups, politically motivated groups or other organizations, are no longer there. The restraints are gone. There are transforming events in society, the spread of technology, the spread of communications, the internet. I hate to, everybody blames the internet for everything, but that's part of the package here. The world has been transformed. Terrorism has been transformed with that, and biological terrorism is part of that new package. It's not the whole package, but it's part of the problem.
I would like to add something here. I don't think there's a great deal of evidence that biological terrorism is the new terrorism right now. I think what we're talking about is the potential for it. We're seeing increased interest on the part of domestic extremists and others in acquiring these weapons, but we can't really say it's the new terrorism at this point. So I don't think it's a good idea for you to go out and tell the American public that this is the current threat. I don't think that's really accurate. I think that we're concerned about the potential based on what we see.
Very much so. It's a question of being prepared. It's not a question of declaring this as the brand new problem. Its potential has been around for many, many, many years. What we're doing now is facing it and trying to be prepared for something that we hope will never happen. By being prepared, I would say we lessen the likelihood of these things happening, because it becomes more difficult for a perpetrator, either at the state level or the terrorist level, to actually succeed in doing what they want. And that's the key to the work that everyone's doing now.
Absolutely.
Excuse me, David, just one more thing.
Jason.
The very simple message that I would like to get across to the public is that there is a range of threat, and the extreme high-end catastrophic biological terrorist incidents, that the scenarios that we can come up with, represents a very, very small portion of what is actually likely. What is likely is probably relatively more easily addressable than those extremely catastrophic events, so that these hoaxes, they now have a disproportionate effect. They terrorize, they create a lot of disruption, and I think if the public were more aware that even if someone does open an actual envelope full of anthrax spores, that situation is not nearly as dramatic as it's made out to be.
I don't know if I completely concur with that.
I didn't think you would.
I absolutely agree. And coming from a country that's lived with terrorism since 1969, and we've had a lot of people killed with things in envelopes that blow your hands off or blind you, then yes, I mean, it's a question of getting the risk in proportion.
Yes, biological terrorism, again, it's the flavor du jour of the threat right now, and threats are running at one a day across the country. However, it's the risk of catastrophic event if it were to occur, but the likelihood, as I'm agreeing with the panel, is that regular terrorism will continue unabated using more conventional weapons, bombs, guns, but the risk is great if they were to switch to biological terror as the expertise in this becomes more widespread. We have come to the end of our allotted time, but I'd like to have two more questions. I hope your questions and answers will be brief, and I saw this gentleman first.
I'm Cham Dallas, Director of Toxicology at the University of Georgia. I have a question just open to the entire panel. We had a good presentation there on the Soviet stockpile of biological weapons. Mine is about the South African research that was done. There was a lot of media press on the so-called race-based agent that would affect only blacks. And in fact, there were at least press reports of some people being killed there. Is there anything we know about that? Or that program certainly has been shut down, but what do we face with that? And that's questions open to the entire panel.
All right.
Pardon? Go first. While you collect your thoughts, perhaps I could just address that. If you look at genetic weapons and you say we're trying to target one race more than another, The differences within races in humans are sometimes much greater than the ones between races. If you take a look at your human genome, 98.5% is the same as in chimpanzees. So that if you're then saying, well, we need to identify one race and not another, that's extremely difficult from a biological point of view. If you consider the DoD 1996 report on genetic engineering and its implications for biological warfare agents, they point out that there were no new genetic weapons that were developed despite the massive effort by the former Soviet Union. And indeed, what they did was to treat bubonic plague with the kind of antibiotics that they wanted it to become resistant to, creating thus the super bubonic plague. But they left that, if you will, a back door in there so that they could protect people they wanted to, who knew what the correct antibiotic was for it. So I would see that as a more practical approach if somebody wanted to do genetic weapons, is to, there are ways you could do that using more conventional technologies, is the one that I've identified from the former Soviet Union. And if you take a look at what genetic weapons have been engineered over the last few years, the Russians have that one where they spliced the anthrax and another agent to try to beat a vaccine. That, fortunately, is reported to be unstable. So the whole idea about we have to be concerned about genetic weapons, absolutely. Personally, though, I'm much more concerned about anthrax, which has been around since biblical times, and once symptoms start to present, we can't really do a lot for people who are presenting symptoms. It was the first bacillus photographed by Robert Koch. I'm much more concerned about anthrax than I am about genetic weapons at this time, because I know what anthrax can do.
David, let me climb out on the ledge, though, just for a little bit here. I mean, we live in an era today in which high school students are encouraged to send away for $30 gene splicing kits. The rules of engagement, if you will, have transformed rather dramatically since the mid-1980s in terms of what we understand about genetics, what we understand about bioengineering. The South African program, by all accounts, by the accounts that I've seen anyway, was certainly a serious program, though probably not a terrifically successful one. Certainly they build on the notion that there are diseases, there are vectors which appear to be targeted or appear to be more receptive among certain elements of the population. There are other national governments that are reported to have also addressed the issue of genetically engineered weapons, particularly countries that represent ethnic enclaves within larger populations. And some of that research, probably defensive nature, probably continues at this time. It's worth noting that the Royal Academy of Medicine recently issued a report, and in fact has lobbied before the World Health Organization, specifically on the topic of genetically engineered weapons. The prospect for the combination of genetic engineering, weapons design, and also the advancing knowledge of the human genome to perhaps isolate that one strand of chromosome that makes the difference and potentially creates a weapon. Is it out there right now? Not likely, but that is, there are a lot of bears out there that are on the horizon that aren't here yet.
Absolutely, it's a possibility, but I'm just wondering from an operational point of view how you would test that before you deployed it.
Well, I mean, this illustrates a problem we've had for many years, and it's keeping your eyes out for what's coming over the horizon, as well as taking practical steps to deal with what you know is possible and what you know people can do. I mean, David talks about anthrax. I'm personally more worried about plague and smallpox. But I would concur with both the previous speakers. You have to take a balanced view.
Absolutely. And anthrax is just as one, but the conventional. We promise one more question. Who would that be? I guess the sergeant over here.
Hi, I'm Sergeant Jim McKenna, U.S. Air Force. My question is directed towards Dr. Stern and then maybe an input from Dr. Davis. Earlier you alluded to the fact that, and I think you illustrated very well, the infrastructure to manufacture these agents is quite expensive. But you also alluded to the fact that extremists and their fanaticism to try to acquire these different weapons of mass destruction get a great deal of financial backing. My question is Dr. Davis, when you alluded to the Russian scenario of that they've shut most of these processes down, what inventory system or mechanism is in place to monitor if a country who's in desperate times in need of economic relief, and then you have the Saddam Husseins of the world who's in a position to provide that economic relief, and without having to have the infrastructure that's so carefully monitored by the world, what's to prevent them from making these sales and as a result using weapons of mass destruction just by purchasing them?
Nothing. Well, that's not quite true. As with my previous comments, the whole difficulty about dealing with this subject is holding apparent diametrically opposed things in the head at the same time. And to go back to what you originally said, you have on the one hand the capability of a state like the Soviet Union with lots of money and capability to produce very sophisticated weapons. You have also to remember that that slide that I showed you of the man in the Lancaster bomber in the Second World War, that comes out of a program where I can show you another slide with some ladies in brown coats and mock caps brewing up anthrax in the old-fashioned milk churns. And I can show you the building in which it was done. Because the risk in what you were doing was well assessed at that time. They weren't brewing up, they weren't creating a big aerosol. It's not something you want to do every day, not something that's necessarily easily done or encourage anybody to do. But at the same time as you can do something relatively simply and be successful in maturing your aims, you, on the other hand, and it depends on the scale that you're going to inflict your attack. So many of the possibilities are out there. You have to be aware of those. And I answered fairly directly, nothing necessarily is there to stop people carrying on a program if they wish to. They're quite hard to detect. That's one of the big problems.
I'll just say a few words about domestic extremists. I spoke last week also with one of the leaders of the Montana militia who told me that he thinks the most likely, I went to him as an expert. I told him, I'm not asking whether you're going to use biological weapons. I want to know, based on your expertise, who are the most likely perpetrators to use these weapons domestically in a terrorist attack. And he said disaffected military officers. And it's important to bear in mind that a number of anti-government groups are deliberately recruiting, actively recruiting in the U.S. military. That's not to say that Mr. Troutman himself is doing so. I don't know. Also, I'm not aware, at least based on conversations I've had with domestic extremists, that they are trying to build up contacts with former Soviet biological weapon scientists, but there are international contacts among these groups, and one former neo-Nazi has actually gotten me in touch with a Swedish neo-Nazi. I'm now in regular communication with Sweden's foremost neo-Nazi, so there are, who's being very helpful actually, so, recommending reading material and so on. There definitely are links. I don't know whether they extend to former Soviet biological weapon scientists.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you for your interest and attention. We did reach the end of our period, and if there are other questions, perhaps we could handle them offline. You're invited to be back in your seats by 1:30 when Dr. Joshua Lederberg will conduct the next panel. Thank you very much.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you as well. Thank you very much.
Did I do okay? Really?
Really
Thank you, Jess.
How you doing?
Very good.
Hi, Alan. How are you?
Right on TV.
Oh, thanks. This is such a big crowd. We just really weren't, completely different atmosphere from. Yeah. The truth is, I find it alarming that so many people are infected.
Have you any idea?
Did you hear that? Next panel would have been Joshua Lederberg. That's the one they deleted. That's the one they deleted. They deleted the next panel. This video ends in like seconds. So they deleted the part with Lederberg. I work so hard to find any video recordings. I swear there has been an attempt to delete the legacy of Joshua Lederberg. I can't believe it. I didn't even know he was presenting there. I swear. I just dropped down the tools I had. There was a mention also that there was a day 2. I don't know if I can find the audio for day 2. All we have is the evidence that we have. The fact that they deleted the Lederberg part, they deleted the recording of that. I mean, it's out there somewhere. It'll never be deleted entirely. It's just a matter of could I ever find it? Wow. I mean, I shouldn't be that sad because I didn't even know it existed. But to think for a moment that it might have actually been there and then they deleted it. Wow. So I think that's it for today. This is just a live stream of the past, live archival session. I will take this, divide it up into 2 videos, I believe, and it actually does fit quite nicely into one single video, and then share it. It will fit on the Bio 911 Truth timeline. I realized today I'm not liking that word truth, but for many people, it's a word that they gravitate towards. So in this case, I'm going to allow myself a little bit of hypocrisy by saying Bio 911 Truth, mostly because of the branding that's already been established with AE 911 Truth. That's really where I was going after. I didn't even really think about the truth part because I don't know the truth. All I know is here's evidence, and this is what it suggests. And as you collect more evidence, you continue to refine your analysis. And what you want to have is the most accurate analysis at any one time, and you always want to have the next most accurate analysis, and you keep working towards that. If whatever the truth is, I don't know, you want to be as accurate as possible. God is truth, or whatever that. I don't even know what that means, but what is the truth here? I mean, I have some gut feelings. I have some analysis. I'm sure you do as well. But wow, that was an amazing capture. A lot of it I missed. Like I says, I'm archiving it right now while I do other things. Keep myself busy. Hopefully you're doing the same. You don't need to watch every minute of it. But thank you for watching. Thank you for support. Mark Kulak, KULACZ, Houstonic.live. We'll have another show soon. Love you much. Thank you. Take care. God bless. And by the way, you can just go to HoustonicITS.com or Houstonic.live, HOUSATONIC. I do have a link right there to the Bio 911 Truth timeline on Tiki-Toki. I just started it. Today's April 4th, 2026. It's not going to look really rich until another 2 or 3, 4 weeks. But it's there, and daily you'll see me posting more videos. Sometimes it'll be like you thought maybe you've seen some stuff before. That's okay. Don't worry about it. I'm just trying to make sure I have the right content on the right platform so I can link to it properly. So it's going to be a very, very fruitful, very rewarding exercise. Again, thank you very much. Take care. God bless.